Hello everyone, this is Ed Dentzel, host of Unfound. I wonder if you will consider becoming a supporter of this YouTube channel. By pressing the join button below, you can receive, for just 10 cents a day, the video version of the podcast a day early, the Unfound Now episodes a week early, daily video updates from yours truly, and cool emojis to use during the Monday night live show. Please consider it as you watch the following spectacular video. Thanks. Bernard Wright, Rusness, and Peggy Joyce McKay were a 49-year-old and 41-year-old, respectively, from Wolf Lake, Minnesota. They had been together several years and had a son. On the night of April 3rd, 1976, locals noticed the Rusness-McKay house on fire. Firefighters found the son dead inside. Yet Bernard and Peggy's remains were not there. They were never seen again. I'm Ed Dentzel, and this is Unfound. Fire is another one of those topics that I could have never suspected would get mentioned so much on Unfound. When I started this podcast over 6 years ago, I would put it in the same category as missing people who called for rides, then weren't there when their friends or family arrived. We've had 4 of that type, amazingly. You wouldn't think it would be a thing. With fire, we've had at least 7 disappearances where it has played a role. Once again, surprisingly. Can you name those 7 without peeking? I'll give you a moment. They are in no particular order: Dorianne Myers, Jeremy Burt, Laura Bible and Ashley Freeman, Tyler North, Christian Balky Thompson, and Ronald McNutt, although fire didn't play a role until long after he went missing. For the 6, not including Ronald's, there is no doubt that foul play was the cause in all of them. Thus, what makes sense is when fire is an element of a case, it most likely points to a non-accidental reason for the disappearance. Well, with Bernard Rusness and Peggy McKay, we have a very unique case. But it's that kind that can test our thinking the best. Where should our analysis start? When the smoke clears. And now a summary of the case. This is brought to you by my friend Megan Linez's website, charleyproject.org. Bernard Rusness and Peggy McKay were not married, despite everybody around them believing so. They had been together for almost 10 years and had an 8-year-old son, Brian. Each had prior marriages and children from those relationships. Yet there's nothing on the record that shows this was a problem for anyone. They lived on Peggy's brother's farm. They both had jobs in the automotive industry and had reputations as being very private, quiet people. The only shady point about them that can even be substantiated is that Peggy might have fixed a bidding process for a truck at the car salvage place where she worked. However, this only amounted to a couple $100 overall. So on the night of April 3rd, 1976, passersby noticed flames coming from the basement, then the second floor of Bernard and Peggy's house. Firefighters arrived and put out the flames. The home was a total loss. During a search of the debris, authorities found the partial remains of Brian and the bones of one of the family's dogs. However, Peggy and Bernard were not found, neither inside nor outside the house. They were never seen again. To complicate matters, Bernard, known as being a very protective guy, had left the hood up on his truck in the driveway and the keys in the lock of a shed near the house. These facts, among others, have caused rumors of foul play to swirl over the past 46 years, involving Bernard and Peggy as both victims and suspects. As stated in the opening, fire is a topic on Unfound, coming up on average 1 in 40 episodes. When it does, we almost always believe the fire was started so as to cover up evidence that would lead investigators to the perpetrators of those disappearances. Please keep that in mind as you try to answer these 3 questions during the interview. Number 1, why would a killer or killers leave Brian behind but take Bernard and Peggy? Number 2, why hasn't a cause of the blaze ever been made public? In fact, why did it not seem to be a concern at the time in 1976? And number 3, could Bernard and Peggy have died by accident in the fire and their bodies turned to ash? The science of which I will explain after the interview so you can decide for yourself. The families of both Peggy and Bernard tend to believe foul play occurred, but they can only offer rumors as proof. The guest for this episode is amateur sleuth and expert on these disappearances, Joe Kisner. Unfound News. The Unfound live show is now available as a podcast on your app. Please find this new show and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. You will hear me detail and analyze some of the biggest national and international true crime stories that have made news over the past week. Next, the past few days found me speaking at Florida Southern College in Lakeland and at Nova Southeastern University in Davie. Spectacular engagements, if I may say so myself. Both of them were videoed and are now available on YouTube for members. They are also available on Patreon. Finally, yes, I got the call, and many of you were correct. It seems I will be heading back to Greeley, Colorado for the retrial of Steve Pankey. When? Not sure yet. Probably late October. I'll let you know.
Where you can find Unfound. On these following podcast platforms: Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean, and many others, especially outside the United States. The new podcast, Unfound Live, which comes out on Tuesdays, can also be found on these platforms. Social media sites: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and the newest one, TikTok. Listener support sites: patreon.com/unfound podcast, paypal.me/unfound podcast. The website, theunfoundpodcast.com. The email address, unfoundpodcast@gmail.com. And please mention Unfound at all true crime websites and forums. Thank you.
I'm so happy again to introduce to all of you Joe Kisner. Of course, he was on the Milda McQuillan episode from about a month ago. Well, he is back to talk about the disappearances of Bernard and Peggy. Joe, welcome back to Unfound.
Thanks, Ed. I appreciate the opportunity again to join us.
You're very welcome. We went over your credentials during Milda's episode, but it was kind of right in the middle. But we're going to do that again right now. Why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, what you've done, what you're doing in your life, and then we will eventually get around to how these disappearances caught your eye. But just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself to start.
By trade or by career, I'm a light rail supervisor for Metro Transit in Minneapolis. I live about an hour west southwest of Minneapolis. Um, I've kind of been doing things like this have always held my interest. I started a web page with my daughter, a Facebook page years ago, looking at strange and unusual places and events and people in Minnesota, and kind of things that we could go see within a tank of gas. From there, I kind of moved on. I was turned on to a case of a strange double murder suicide back in 2000 by a coworker who actually investigated it. And that's kind of where I started delving into the police record issues. Um, what I had hoped to do with our little project is eventually make publish like a travel log through Minnesota where people, as they're driving through, could go visit different places, or as they're driving through, find notable things that are unusual things that happen in that area.
Yeah.
And I thought about, okay, what would you do for a follow up after that? Because I've always got to work a little bit ahead, and that's my little ADD in me. And I thought maybe a book on unsolved crimes or missing persons in Minnesota might be interesting to look into. And that's where I kind of started on this foot. And needless to say, the other book is still unpublished, and now I find most of my time occupied doing things like Milda's case and what we're going to talk about, the Bernard Rusness and Peggy McKay disappearance.
So at any point in your life, of course, I think we're close to, the same age, maybe kind of Generation Xers, somewhere in there. At any time in your life, like in your 20s, did you ever think about going into law enforcement or becoming an investigator, anything like that? Or is that just something that popped up later in your life?
Well, I think that's always been one of those things I've always wanted to be as a kid. A newspaper man or a private eye would have been kind of
Okay.
fun. I've always been
Yeah.
interested in the strange and unusual and unsolved things. In the past, I've worked for a couple of different sheriff's departments as corrections and dispatch. I've done fire and EMS. I've been an EMT for 12 years.
Wow.
I was on a fire department for around 5 to 6 years. Then I served as a local police commissioner for 5 years in
Wow.
the past. So I've kind of got a little, not direct investigative experience in the field, but I've got a good feel for what law enforcement does and how they operate with using that
Okay.
background.
All right. And are you like me? Of course, I've told these stories many times when people have asked, going back maybe to the 1970s, like In Search of, Unsolved Mysteries, Cops. Were you a fan of those kind of shows as well, or or is that something that you weren't aware of, or didn't take an interest at the time? What would you say?
Well, I remember In Search of Saturday evenings at 6:30 on Channel 5 KSTP in Minneapolis. Then I was Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack. And
Yeah.
then the old Fox show Sightings, which would go after some of the stranger aspects of the world.
Right.
All those were intriguing. And even some of the dramatized movies back there with a 1970s made for television true event type stories and stuff. It's always intrigued me. It's one of those things where I've always been a daydreamer, and you kind of, you kind of look after that. Uh, my ex-wife would call it a disability, but we're always looking for something that is a little bit beyond the norm, to take away from the mundane of the daily life,
Yeah.
those little mysteries. And it's something that's always worked to help keep my mind occupied.
Right.
Being able to sit down and mull over these different things, over different scenarios and things might have happened, and also like now I enjoy the research. I think I'm fairly good at it,
Okay.
and digging in to see what paths you can go down, and uncovering new information, going down some different directions and stuff has always been
Yeah,
enjoyable.
it's interesting to me because you some of the things that you just about your personalities you've mentioned working for the fire department, EMT, police commissioner. These are all very much group activities where you have to work in a team, fighting a fire or, in an ambulance showing up somewhere, you have to work together to save a person's life. But then you're doing this, which is, as I know, a very solitary activity. So it's a wide range of behavior and choices you make as far as work and, how you spend your free time.
Well, it's when working Monday through Friday type thing when you have your weekends, sometimes you just need to unwind. And that's usually how I end up unwinding. You can just get inside your own head and work things through. Um, it's always nice, though, to have a little collaboration. I've been collaborating a little bit with Eric
Yeah, my
from
assistant. Yeah, sure.
and it's been really nice to be able to run things by each other
Mhm.
and just talk things through. That helps a
Sure.
lot too to go over some of these different things, and that's been a real blessing too. So we talk about every 2 or 3 weeks and stuff for an hour or so, and
Yeah, good. I know you do. Eric has told me about that. Excellent. Let's move on to this. This disappearance, of course, we're talking about today, Bernard Rusness and Peggy McKay. We're going to use the last name McKay. We realized that in NAMUS and elsewhere that her maiden name, which is Parmenter, is used, but officially at the time, her last name was McKay. She and Bernard were never married. So for purposes of this interview, we're going to use the last name McKay, McKay. When did you first hear about these disappearances? Of course, this happened in the 1970s. You're a young man. I was a very young man. Um, but when did you hear about them? Maybe as an adult? Was it well before you ever thought about looking into them, or how did that all come about?
it wasn't that long before I was going through a list of open missing persons cases in Minnesota. I did see it on there, and looking at the little snippets of the circumstances, I thought it was quite interesting.
Mm,
Never looked at it much farther beyond that. Um, I found a case that was close to home, Troy Hallstrom that went missing in 2014 locally here. And as I dug into that, I had met a few people that went to high school with Troy. Troy went to high school about 14 miles from where I actually grew up, and got to know them. And one of the women that I had been working with the Troy stuff uh, introduced me to Lorelei and
mhm.
told me about Lorelai's uh, missing grandmother,
Yeah, Milda, sure.
and asked if I wouldn't mind looking into it because I like digging into that stuff. And then through Lorelei, Bernard's granddaughter was associated with her because of they're both went disappeared in the same county. So her Bernard's granddaughter got a hold of me, and I started kind of working with their family. And when I started doing information requests, I did basically both of them to the Becker County Sheriff's Office for both cases.
And when did that happen?
This was about 4 years ago.
Okay.
Um, it's kind of interesting because I know a lot of people wouldn't be watching and listening to this show if they didn't have some interest in it. And I learned a lot about doing records requests, and every state is a little bit different.
Sure it
In
is.
Minnesota,
Yes.
everything 30 years old is considered an open case.
Hmm.
And that's how I presented it to the county attorney and the sheriff's office when I did the initial request. Got a lot of kickback from the county attorney's office stating that it's still an open case, blah, blah, blah. I went to the state data practices office that specializes in information releases and stuff like that. And they weren't a lot of help. I ended up having to do my own little litigation with the county attorney. Um,
Hmm.
they kept saying it's an open case, we can't release. And I said, it doesn't matter because it's 30 years old.
Yeah.
And the whole homicide stuff was all conjecture, essentially, anyway. So I got a lot of experience doing that. But once the assistant county attorney finally gave up, the sheriff's department was very helpful on those files. So that's one thing I'd say is learn the data practices laws of the state you're working with and be a little relentless.
So you got this start, but this all kind of started 4 years ago, 2018, somewhere around there.
Right around there, yes.
Okay. Your impression now that you, of course, are as well, well versed in this disappearance as anybody on the earth, in the state of Minnesota where you still live, would you say it's a very well-known disappearance? Of course, maybe a lot of people who don't live there, maybe the first disappearance they're going to think of in Minnesota maybe is Joshua Guimond's, of course, is a disappearance you and I have talked about behind the scenes. But overall impression of these two people's disappearances? Well known, not so well known? Where does it all fall in all of the disappearances that have happened in the state of Minnesota?
I'd say Jacob Wetterling and Josh
Mm,
Kimon are probably two of the
right,
bigger cases. A lot of people haven't heard of it. Um, I guess nationally, when you start looking at blogs and Reddits and stuff like that, there are
right.
threads that have popped up about it over the years
Mm-hmm.
because it's a very, very intriguing case. But I think
Unique.
maybe at the time, there might have been a little more notoriety of it, but I think it's been forgotten by a lot of people.
Yeah.
When I did speak with the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension in St. Paul, uh, the investigator I talked to there said, "Oh, we still refer to it as the Wolf Lake case."
Huh.
So it seems to still be in the minds of people around that office. But yeah, it's kind of hit or miss. Like I said, I'd probably find more people out of the state that are aware of the case than people in the state.
Interesting. That's interesting. Just off the top of your head, I would not expect you to know this, but off the top of your head, would you say there are a lot of disappearances in Minnesota? I mean, you've obviously looked at them and you decided on particular ones. Milda's, these two disappearances. I mean, how many are there to pick from off the top of your head? Do you even know?
It's kind of strange because I looked through the BCA missing persons clearinghouse the other day, and some of the cases have moved in and out of there. Um, I swore at one time I looked in there that Milda and Bernard and Peggy were in there, and they've since rotated out. There's some cases that are still in there, some that aren't. Um, I think it's you've got a lot that disappeared hunting.
Yeah.
A lot of them are have circumstances like you've covered too, where there might be some outside factors. There might have been addictions. There might have been mental
Right.
illness
Sure.
like that involved with it. And not to take away from those cases, but um, there aren't as many where there just no logical
Mm,
reason or nothing you can deduct from.
right.
There aren't as many of those around.
Of
I think
course, we
you've
have to
covered.
remember Minnesota. Minnesota is not one of the more populous states. It's certainly not like Florida. Of course, Florida is the third most populous. I would say Minnesota is probably in the bottom 20 or something like that. But maybe 100 unsolved missing persons cases that are over like a year old, probably at least, right? Or
Oh yeah,
certainly
I'm sure
probably
there
twice
are.
that many here in Florida, at least.
What we always got to look at too is what gets reported in those statistics
Sure.
are runaways,
Yeah.
people that probably chose to kind of abandon their life. I don't think that's all that popular these days because it's a little more difficult to do. But I mean, when I worked with the sheriff's office, we in the PD, we might have entered, 3 or 4 a week, and then they'd
Yeah.
be resolved. A runaway case or something like that gets put into the NCIC database, just like a missing persons. You'll have a missing endangered type scenario or a parental abduction scenario. So there's some different categories it goes into. So I'm not sure when they announce these numbers where they all fall into. If it's,
Mhm.
um,
Yeah.
I think a lot of them are in those scenarios where runaways, parental abductions, things like that.
Okay. All right, well, let's move on to the two people we'll be talking about in this interview. Let's start with Bernard. Let's just talk about him in just very general terms about, his family, what he did for work. What were some of the words that maybe people might use regarding him? Was he friendly? Was he not so friendly? I mean, what did people say about Bernard? Once again, just in general terms, as a human being, what can we say about Bernard?
I think from the people that knew him earlier on, um, I think he was a cordial guy. And I know it seems like a lot of people would knew him from, they might go to the bar occasionally type thing.
Mm-hmm.
He worked as a body shop technician, I think, most of the time prior to being in Wolf Lake. That lived in the Twin Cities South Metro area. It seems like he had a lot of associates yet from down in Minneapolis that it seemed like he was knew a lot of people down there. Up in Wolf Lake was a little bit different story. A few people that I know he might have associated with seem to also be kind of body shop guys as well.
Mm-hmm. And of
Um,
course, he had, so this was his work that he was doing at the time of his disappearance. So he worked for a big dealership in the area.
yeah, he worked for a Chevrolet dealership in Fargo,
Mhm.
along with his eldest son. Worked there, and Peggy had worked at a place called Twin Cities Auto Salvage. Doesn't exist anymore. More of a salvage tow yard type thing.
Okay. And Bernard, though, we have to remember Bernard and Peggy were an item at the time of their disappearance, but Bernard did have an ex-wife, or maybe he was still married to her. What do we want to say about his other family? How many children did he have? What was that whole situation at the time of his disappearance?
Well, Bernard was still married to his wife in Fargo. I believe they married in the mid to late 40s.
Hmm.
He did have 4 children with her.
Okay.
Um, then there was a few more children with another woman from Frazee, Minnesota. It's 2 of those siblings that I've been working with primarily. And
Okay.
then I believe there was another one in 1957. And then there was Brian. So I think there was 11 in total.
Wow. Bernard had 11 kids.
Yeah. And
Wow. All right.
and
That
then
guy. Well, okay.
yeah.
Well, he's certainly making up for me, who has 0. Okay. Wow. Okay. So he had these other families, other women that he had been with, had children, multiple children, and you even said that he worked with one of his children at that dealership. Is this Bernard the third? Is that
Yeah. Yeah,
that's
that would
Bernard
be
the third?
Bernard,
And
the
okay.
eldest son.
All right. And so that would have been from his first wife.
Yeah, from his wife. Yeah.
Okay, we'll talk about that son maybe a little later. All right, let's move on to Peggy. You've already mentioned her a little bit, but what do you want to say about her? What is have people said about her, her personality? Already mentioned kind of in the introduction here that she had been married and gotten divorced. Did she have any children from prior marriages, prior relationships? What can you say about her?
Peggy is a little harder to find things out on. I know she had married in 1957 or 52, and pardon me for not remembering right offhand here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, she had at least 2 children. I want to say possibly 3, but as I was trying to go through my notes, wherever I had that written down was gone.
Okay.
Um, she lived in, her and her husband, Owen McKay, lived in Fargo. Peggy worked predominantly as a waitress in Fargo, and I believe that's where her and Bernard met at a place called the Silver Tray in 1966.
Hmm. Wow.
And
So they had been, so once again, this disappearance happened in 1976. So they had known each other or been together for like 10 years.
yeah, from there is a police incident that occurred at the Silver Tray where it sounds like Peggy's husband came to the bar one night with a shotgun to confront
Wow.
Bernard and Peggy.
Wow.
And I believe that was nothing really became of it. Um, I think the police understood where he was coming from at the time, and everything, cooler heads prevailed, and they went their separate ways. And I believe that's when uh, Peggy and her husband started to part ways there.
Okay.
So Bernard, and from what I understand, right around that same time, Brian who we're going to talk about here.
Mm-hmm.
The last child was born in January of 67. And I know he was born in Shakopee, Minnesota, one of the southern suburbs. So I believe after the incident with at the Silver Tray in 66, at some point in there, Bernard and Peggy moved to the South Metro where Bernard works for a few different car dealerships. And that's where we can show where Brian was born down there.
Okay. Is it your impression then that Peggy was cheating on her husband with Bernard, and that's how this Brian was conceived, or was their son conceived after Peggy had already gotten divorced? What is your perception of it?
I've never really done the math. What it seems though is that she was having a relationship with Bernard and eventually ended her marriage.
Okay,
They
so
did
she
officially
this all right, so
divorce.
something started before she was officially divorced, and maybe that's what brought about the divorce.
And I didn't start looking at conception dates or anything like
Okay.
that.
All right. Gotcha. So I guess what we're also saying this shotgun story. This was like 10 years before these two went missing.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. So this is not something that happens close to that. Okay. All right. And why do you think it has been maybe a little harder for you to find information on Peggy than it has been for Bernard? Your impression working on this for 4 years.
Well, I think part of it is the way the relationship was. Um, when you look at Bernard left his family in Fargo and had essentially another family um, in that area and coupled up with Peggy. And I think Peggy then, divorcing her husband, alienating herself from that family. The husband still had the kids and raised them.
Okay.
I think there's wasn't as many people involved with their relationship. Everybody said they were rather quiet, kept to themselves. So there wasn't a lot of interaction. I think people knew them around town. Um, the farm that this all took place on actually was owned at that time, at this time of the incident, by Peggy's brother George. Um, Prior to that, that farm place had been owned by Peggy's parents, and they moved out there from Fargo as kind of a retirement place, a hobby farm. And then
Okay.
just, I don't know, I'm jumping ahead here, but when
Well, I just want to stick on. Is it the reason that you don't have as much information about Peggy is because her family just has not been very vocal over the years? Is it because that Peggy was a fairly private person? What's your impression of that?
I don't believe there's been much passed on. I think her ex-husband was from all accounts that I've got, was a very quiet, uh, humble guy who took the task of raising his kids seriously. I don't think a lot was said about it. I did manage to talk with the wife of Peggy's grandson a couple of years ago for a bit, and the family really didn't know much about what happened or any of the details.
Oh,
They didn't know that she was missing, but that was
oh,
about the extent of it. I did get to fill them in on a few things that I knew, but I don't think it wasn't talked about. I mean, you can go find the vital statistics on Peggy,
yeah.
but on that, there's not a lot there.
So are
Not a
you
lot.
also saying, if she had any brothers or sisters, for example, that they haven't done many interviews over the years, like with any local papers or local media regarding her disappearance? That's just not something that's out there.
No, most of the interviews and stuff have been with Bernard's family and Bernard's kids.
Hmm.
Um, Peggy's brother George, that owned the property, is deceased. I did talk with one of Peggy's sisters, Sally, out in Seattle, and verified some information and talked to her about some stuff. She has not. Uh, they interviewed her once right after the incident, and nobody's talked to her since then.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
she had not any contact. She didn't have any contact with or very little contact with the children from Peggy's marriage um, after she moved away from the area. So she's kind of grown separate from the family a little bit, especially after their parents died.
Okay. All right, let's move on to this. Just about their son, whose name is Brian. Do we know anything? Of course, I think he was 8 years old when this all happened. Do we know anything about him in particular? Was he? I'm guessing he was like in about what, second or third grade, or maybe he was homeschooled for all I know. But do we know anything in particular about him from anybody?
One thing in there was that there was they had a local person that babysat for Brian,
Huh.
uh, and like Peggy would drop him off, and Bernard would pick him up in the afternoon and evening
Hmm.
after school. I'm not sure where he attended school. That was always something I wanted to verify once and see if I could find maybe any classmates of his back in second or third grade, just for some recollections. And what I gathered from the statements is that Brian was rather a quiet kid. Um, didn't interact with his dad a lot when they saw those, and he was kind of a mama's boy in essence. He
Uh,
was very attached to Peggy, and they had a. It seemed like he and Peggy had quite a bond together.
in this relationship, anything in your in talking to all these people and doing your own work, any allegations in this relationship between Bernard and Peggy of any abuse? We have to remember they were not technically married, even though they've been living together for a while. Any abuse, any domestic violence, anything like that ever been alleged?
Nothing that I've ever found. Um, I do think there might have been another relationship with Bernard in that time he was with Peggy. I
Huh.
don't think it was anything substantial.
Hmm.
Um, Peggy, from what it seems like, I don't know much about the time they spent in the Twin Cities. Just seemed to be uh, a mom.
Hmm.
Again, there's not a lot about her put out there. Just a
Okay.
few things about locally. She went to church with another family here and there, and went to Bible study type stuff, and that was about the extent of anything with Peggy. But nobody was really aware in that area of their relationship. In fact, most people thought they were married. That's
Yeah.
why sometimes you find her addressed as Peggy Rusness.
Okay.
Um, there were some friends of theirs that lived up north that they did like to uh, drink or have parties and have people over and drink. I don't think there was anything to the point of being a problem, but that was the social thing back then too. You get together, play cards, have a few drinks. That seemed to be the extent of their social life, at least at that time. But nobody ever noted anything of any real disagreements between them at all.
Okay. Let's move on to this. Just some, what we might call issues. Of course, anytime people get divorced and they have children from prior marriages and a lot of bad blood can pop up. Children get jealous of the new children, ex-wives, there's custody and all sorts of things. Once again, your impression, how much was this an issue with Bernard and Peggy with the prior marriages, relationships, and children that they had? How big of an issue was this overall?
It's kind of unclear. I know from statements given by Bernard's wife that he would stop by at holidays and stuff, bring some birthday cards, things like that. I don't think he was real involved with the children from his marriage life, besides for the oldest son, who was in his mid 20s when this happened. Um, Kind of unclear about his relationship with the middle group of children.
Hmm.
Um, and it's not something we've ever really delved into. However, I don't imagine it was real intimate of a relationship. I don't know how much time he actually spent with them, especially working and having Brian and then living in the cities and things like that. So I don't think though there was any real conflict from what I've with like Peggy and her ex-husband. I don't not sure how much contact she had with them
Hmm.
in that 10-year, 11-year span there. Um, one of her uh, daughters that I had tried to reach out to, I found out passed away last year, and that's how I got connected with the grandson's uh, spouse.
Mm-hmm.
So again, there's not a lot out there about it. One thing I've heard that her ex-husband was a very hardworking, kind, quiet guy, and there was no his name really never came up in the investigation. It was asked you, hey, maybe we should go back and look at him. I think they both went on and started living their own lives and moved on. I don't believe he ever remarried or anything either.
Okay. All right. So as far as we can tell, doesn't sound like a lot as far as we know here. And we're doing this interview on September 12th, 2022. As far as we can tell, even though we know, I mean, we're all adults here for the most part, that, we sometimes people do have problems with their exes and being estranged from their children and things like that. Not maybe a big factor in their lives as far as you can tell, Joe.
No, and I kind of looked at that too, even with the when you have when you're involved with that many relationships, you might say that there might be somebody outside the family or outside
Yeah.
uh, the people that might be um, looking to like not liking how you treated their family member.
Yeah, sure.
And I went
Happens.
and um, even the mother of a few of his children too. I looked into her family a little bit. She had one brother that had passed away, I believe, in World War II. Otherwise, there wasn't that. You know, I thought maybe there was a big brother thing going on there. You know what? You messed with my sister type thing.
Yeah.
But I didn't find anything like that out there either. So I
Okay.
didn't find any sense of motivation within those immediate families that would.
Okay, so I guess the answer then is no. As far as we know, maybe there was, but no proof of any bitterness or any violence or threats or anything that have been able to be tracked down. 40, what would it be? 46 years later. Okay, let's move on to this, and I think we're going to get into this a little bit. We'll get into this a little bit deeper. But there are stories, though, out there that maybe Bernard and Peggy might have been involved in a couple shady things, not exactly like robbing banks or anything, but there's are a few stories out there. Where do these stories come from? When did these stories start coming out? I've seen some of the paperwork on it. How did you get it? Um, we don't know if we're going to get to, but maybe do a little theorizing later. But but of course, any shadiness, you have to start looking at this for a disappearance. What can you say about this? Once again, just in brief.
As far as well, Bernard was involved with body work and stuff like that with the I'm sure
Hmm.
there's insurance stuff involved, and he actually worked at Twin Cities Auto Salvage prior to going to work for the Chevrolet dealership where Peggy was working. Um, when you start to deal with stuff like that, you can speculate that there might be a little some things going on there, and I
Hmm.
think people trying to scam their insurance company a little bit is probably more common than what
Yeah,
you most of us think.
probably. I
But
agree.
the only thing uh, that seemed to be concurred is that apparently at one time that those Twin Cities Auto Salvage where Peggy worked at auctioned off vehicles that they had there, salvage stuff. And apparently at one point there was a semi tractor that a company from Wisconsin was interested in, or outfit from Wisconsin was interested in. And from what I gathered in a few different statements throughout the documents, that Peggy um, was given a sum of money to open the bids for that semi tractor overnight and then place a bid for $50 higher than the highest bid in the name of this company from Wisconsin.
Huh. And
That
she
seemed
was
to
and
be,
she was paid to do this. She was given a sum to do this.
yeah, and
Okay.
that seems to be, it was brought up by a few different people in there. Um, Bernard had brought it up to another friend and said that he was offered that, but he turned it down. Uh, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So that would be one instance where that would happen. And I've seen things too when you're dealing with salvage yards and things like that. The salvage yard was owned by a husband and wife from St. Paul, Minnesota. This was kind of an offshoot of theirs. So they were still in the Twin Cities, and Bernard and at first, then Peggy kind of managed the operation, did the books and things like that. So that's, I'm sure there's a few more things. Just I've dealt with people in similar industries that have done some under the table things as well. So
All right. Um, do we know what the eventual result was of this bidding process? Did this company end up getting that bid, or, how did that end up going? Do we even know what the outcome was?
from what I gather, it happened. That's what was done, and the money exchanged hands.
All right,
For
so this successfully was pulled off that this company from Wisconsin did end up getting this vehicle that was at the salvage yard.
from what I
Your
understand.
understanding, okay. And how, just on a date on that, was this like just like a month before they went missing, a year before? Do we even know? When was this?
I would say that it had been within, see, it happened in April. I'd say probably within the last 6 months prior to.
All right, so within a half year of this happening. Okay. All right, so we'll get a little deeper into that. I'm sure a little later. Let's move on to this. Being that we know in this particular disappearance, the house that they were living in was burned down. This is not the first time we've talked about a house being burned. I think this will be the third time we've talked about this on Unfound. But you've already stated it, who owned it, but we'll go through it again. Who actually owned the house? How long? And then how long had Bernard and Peggy been living there? Let's talk about that.
Well, Peggy's brother, like I said earlier, Peggy's parents bought that property and moved out as a retirement place from the Fargo area. Then I believe when they passed, all the property went to Peggy's brother George. The rest of the kids got a cash from the estate. And from what I gather, once her parents had died and George had taken over the property, Peggy and Bernard were living in the Twin Cities metro area. And Peggy and Brian moved from the metro back up to Wolf Lake and moved into the house, I guess, just to keep it occupied because her brother had another property that he lived at. And Bernard commuted for a while on weekends, excuse me, from the Twin Cities up there, and eventually left his job in the cities and moved back to Wolf Lake,
Mm-hmm.
and then took work in Fargo. And so they were basically, from what I understand, is caretaking and working on the residence, remodeling it. The question is who was paying for things. It was probably a bit between George and them. And I don't know if the ultimate objective was that they were going to end up purchasing the house or keeping the house, or if they were doing it to put things in order so that at some point uh, George could sell it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
They were.
How long had Bernard been living at that location, being that he eventually moved in with Peggy and living there? Of course, they had a child together. How long was Bernard living at that location before this all happened?
I want to say, if I recall correctly, it was right around 75 when
Okay.
Bernard moved back up there. And I'm not real clear as to when Peggy had moved up. I know um, it had to be within a few years, 74, 75, right around there, when they actually moved up to the property.
Okay, so not long, but not short either. Of course, we have to remember they'd known each other for 10 years, but they had only been living together on that property for maybe a year,
It was probably, yeah, more like a couple,
a couple
or
years.
I'm thinking like 75, 74-ish.
Okay.
I'd have to refresh too and see where. I'm sure I've got some kind of a better date than that, but
Okay. So we're not saying the whole entire time, but he just kind of knew moving up there. Um, you said they were remodeling. They were doing this work themselves. I have to ask, being that they didn't technically own it, was like the brother paying for this and they were doing the work, or do we have any specifics on all of that? Because we have to remember, eventually this house burnt to the ground. even though it was getting remodeled at the time. So who was paying for these remodeling, and who was doing the work?
Well, I think Bernard and Peggy were doing a lot of the work. Believe they put a new septic system in, did some cabinets and things like that. And they were, I believe they were living there basically rent free. And I think in
Hmm.
turn, some of that work was going on in the house to remodel it and stuff. What the ultimate outcome would have been, I have no idea. It's never really stated there as to whether George was going to just let them have the house or if they were going to buy it from him or sell it after the work was done.
Mhm.
There's not really clearly stated anywhere in there.
Okay. And on this property, there are other buildings. What in general can you say about these? You've already said it's kind of like a hobby type of farm that the parents had before. What other buildings are on this property?
As you come up the driveway, there's at towards the end of the driveway, the house will be on your left-hand side. There's some lilac bushes and a walkway going up to the front of the house. And off to your right would be a storage shed. And then directly in front of you would have been a barn. It's not your atypical, don't, you know, barn.
Hmm.
It's a large red shed essentially.
Okay.
Um, and then off to that would have been the windmill and the pump house to the just to the left of that barn. And as you come into the back side of the house, there's a two-car garage off on the offset a ways. And then next to the house, there was a small shed, which probably would have been first purposed for like gardening type stuff, you know, a potting shed or something. And I believe at the time Bernard used that to like repair firearms and stuff on his spare
Wow.
time.
Okay, so he
And
did that in his spare time, working with guns in his spare time. Okay.
everything is still there except for obviously the house. I was on the property a few years ago. The house is obviously gone and the pump house is gone, but the other buildings are still standing and still there as they were at the time of the fire. As a matter of fact, there's still a swing hanging from the tree, which is kind of,
Hmm.
I
A
don't
little
know,
creepy.
yeah,
Yeah, a little
just
creepy. Yeah. Do you know it's maybe not a question I've thought to ask you before. I have to admit, it's been 46 years. They never built another house on the property, so nobody ever lived on that property again after this happened in 1976.
no, and it's currently the it's used as pasture land by the current owner.
Mhm.
Um,
Hmm.
so the first time I talked to him about going up there, he was actually grazing cattle on the property, but the second time, he didn't have cattle on that property anymore. So there's a lot of pasture land, some trees surrounding the house, and then pasture land out to the south side of the house.
Okay.
So,
That is interesting to me. The brother continued to own that land after the house burnt down, but never built another house on there. I'm going to think about that. Okay. Let's move on to this. And just, of course, a lot of the people who listen to this program are not out there in the hinterlands, the rolling hills of the United States. But we're going to talk about this just so everybody knows what this word means. And we're going to be talking about a furrowed driveway. What does furrowed mean?
or harrowed,
Harrowed road. Yeah,
basically
harrowed. Yes.
out in the rural areas, um, most driveways are gravel. And during the spring, you get like a lot of the frost heaves and stuff coming up. The driveways will get very wet with the spring rain and the thawing, and they'll become potholed and rough and muddy. And what they basically would do is um, on the gravel roads today too, they have graders that will go out and turn the rock and the gravel over to promote driving, and that's basically what happened in the driveway. they they would come out and basically turn the driveway over or till it up a little bit
Hmm.
to level it and then promote drying because we're in the early part of April where I don't
Yeah.
believe there's a lot of snow around at that time, but we're in that thawing season. And a lot of times you'll hear it, or if I'd never really heard the term before, but harrowed is one of the things that
Harrowed.
a farm term that we harrowed the driveway. We turned it
Okay.
over, plowed it
And
up
so
again.
does that leave it a little it'll dry faster, but maybe a little sloppy? Would it promote, of course, where we're going with this, would this mean that maybe, for example, tire tracks might be easier to see in a harrowed driveway in contrast to a regular driveway or gravel driveway? What would you say, your experience?
Well, it would be soft because it was just turned up because the gravel would eventually compacts down, and then in the spring that's where that mud is at. So they go in it and end up turning that all over, re-putting the rocks over. So the driveway would be rather soft at that time. And I don't know if people are familiar, like when you till a garden, something you
Yeah,
turn it over, there's a smooth surface. So anything that basically goes on that is going to leave
a
indentations through
footprint or
there.
something, whether
Then
it's a
with the
human
Harley,
footprint or
eventually,
something like that. Okay.
yeah, eventually
All
when the
right.
driveway's moving on, it compacts again and firms up.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about that in a moment because some of the people who came upon the scene talk about that. All right. So let's move up. So this is everything that was going on in Bernard and Peggy's lives. They had these jobs, pretty standard life. Two people living together. They have a son together. They're all living on this property, fixing it up, which I think is noteworthy, being that eventually the house burnt down, and just kind of living their lives. They have, of course, Bernard has a lot of children, but it seems not a lot of things, at least here in general, for them to be worried about. So let's move up to April 3rd, 1976. What do we know about earlier in that day? Was this a work day for both of them? Was this a school day? What day of the week was this? What do we know, or do we know anything about earlier in the day?
It was a Saturday, and from what I've never found anything in the reports. It's online. There's some things out there stating that the driveway was harrowed or turned over earlier in the day that day,
That the very day. Wow. Okay.
and that there was reports of them being in town at the grocery store. I've never read anything about that in the reports. It's not saying that it didn't happen. It might have been relayed in like a newspaper interview with somebody, saying, "Well, I just saw him earlier today." None
Mm-hmm.
of that is actually in the reports that happened that day.
Okay.
There was things we know or can assume. It was a Saturday. The weather was rather, I mean, it was nice. It was, I believe, in the 50s, 60s type thing where a person could go work outside comfortably.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, there was a hood up on one of the vehicles, a pickup truck, um, to indicate that they at one time during the day they were outside working.
Okay.
But that's really about we all know
Mm-hmm.
factually for that
Okay.
day.
So I guess what I'm asking you, maybe just as it just once again, just an example. Did any did for example, did Bernard talk to any of his children or friends on the phone that day? Have you ever heard anything like that?
Not that was ever brought up about anything, any conversations that have gone on through that day.
Okay.
That was one thing too. It's kind of surprised me too, is that um, there was no phone records in the um,
Mhm.
case files, and I would have thought that that would have been something that would have been did because back in the day, before cell phones,
Yeah,
you've got your. I know where I grew up, everything outside of town, and I lived in a small town, was long
yeah,
distance.
that's right. Me
You got
too.
the bill every month with the little charges and the numbers you
Yes,
call on
yes,
those.
that's right. That's right. You
Yeah,
wanted to call somebody 10 miles away, it cost you.
yeah, kids
Yep.
these days will never know
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, we'll never know. Yeah.
So that was one
Uh,
thing that was absent. I really wish something like that would have been included, but
Right.
it wasn't.
Okay. So we don't, it just doesn't seem we have a lot of solid information about anything earlier that day. But I don't know if we're going to the point of saying they actually disappeared during the day, right?
Yeah, we don't know.
Okay.
I mean, there's indications, that we had talked about.
Mhm.
Um, and we'll probably get into that a little more with the
We
fire,
will. We
but
will. I guess what we're saying is the timeline of this day is not as precise as we'd like it to be.
exactly
Okay. All
nothing.
right. So this is just something that people have to remember. We're going to talk about what these witnesses then saw, but it's still a little bit up in the air as to when these disappearances actually happened. So we have to keep that in mind. All we know is, I guess, the day before that Bernard was at work that Friday with the job that he had. And then sometime before Saturday night, when these flames were seen, something happened. So let's move on to that. And of course, a lot of this paperwork, Joe is going to make a lot of this paperwork available on his own on the discussion group. He has permission to post some of these things we're going to be talking about. Paperwork, witness statements, everything. And I will, of course, be posting these on Unfound's website, both places, so you can see these things for yourselves, what these people said right then at the time in 1976 from reports. But in your own words, Joe, what did these people see on that night? What time? What did these witnesses see regarding that house?
Well, the initial report was made by a woman driving home from work who was driving by the property. The property itself, the house itself, probably sits. I actually went and measured it at one time. Probably 100 and some yards off the actual gravel road in the front of the house. When this woman was driving by, she looked over and noted that she saw flames in the basement window on the northwest corner of the house. She turned around, drove back into town to notify the fire department. This is days before 911, and it's kind of a little different than when I was on the fire department too. So she drove back into town to notify the fire department. She stated it was right around 11 p.m.
Okay.
Roughly the time that was also said to be 11 p.m., a carload of kids, you'd call them that now, were driving up County Road 43 north going into Wolf Lake to go up to the bar. And they noticed flames off to the side of the road. They were on a road that would be parallel to the farmhouse. And they went up to see if what was burning. So they pulled up. They found the house. When they approached, they found flames coming out in one of the upstairs windows and then through the roof line on the northwest side of the house. They pulled up the driveway. They noticed, it was noted that they almost got stuck because the driveway was soft
Right.
from having
We
been
just talked about. Yep. Okay. Very good.
They pulled up to the residence. They approached the house. The doors were locked. They looked inside. They didn't see anybody on the main floor. They went and turned off the LP gas tank leading to the house to protect it. And eventually, when they couldn't make entry, turned back around and went back into town to notify the fire department to find out that they're already getting ready to come out there. Mm-hmm. By the time the fire department arrived at the house, it was fully engulfed.
Yeah.
They basically had to go into a defensive mode to protect the other buildings on the property.
Okay. Now, maybe I should have asked you this. You being that you've been there, and maybe things have changed since 1976. Regarding neighbors, how close do other people live to this property?
There is a turkey farm across the road and down maybe a quarter mile. But I do not believe I don't know what it was like back then. That's not an occupied farm. It's the long, more industrial type farm with the long buildings that house, hundreds and hundreds of turkeys. So I don't believe there's a house on that property exactly. I can't recall offhand. But otherwise, you're looking at neighbors were usually the long driveways were fairly common. So you're looking at it's a farm field or two away from
maybe quarter mile.
Yeah, probably because usually a township square is a mile by a mile square, and there might be one other house down the line from there. So.
Okay, so that might be a reason, maybe, that a neighbor did not notice the flames. Is because they just don't live that close. And of course, it's a Saturday night. Maybe they're, of course, not looking for flames anyway. Maybe.
And with a fire, talk about this a little bit more, but like we said, from the woman driving by the house, seeing the flames in the basement window, to the kids driving up County Road 43, seeing the flames in the sky, both of them said it was right around 11 o'clock. So we're looking maybe a 10 to 15-minute window right around that time. So it took off relatively quickly. So I don't know if a neighbor might have eventually seen it, although it was 11 o'clock at night. A lot of
Yeah.
people were probably in bed at that time. There were some trees surrounding the backside of the property. Excuse me, not in abundance, but were enough where it would shelter until the flames got higher, it would shelter any visibility to the house from
Okay.
other parts of the.
Just want to make sure the listeners understand why it took two passersby in cars to see the fire first, in contrast to a neighbor. And the reason is that the neighbors just don't live that close. Let's move on to this. So when the fire department shows up, of course, you do that these days, Joe. But you've already stated that it was beyond. There was nothing that could be done. Uh, Eventually, what was left? Was anything left of the house? Was it anything in the house standing at all, or had it just all collapsed in on itself? What is your understanding?
There was one wall left standing, or part of a wall, I believe, on the south side of the house, that one of the fire departments in their statement stated that they ended up pushing into the fire to let it burn away because it was unstable. So basically, the house burned to ash by the time it was all said and done. Uh, the firefighters that I talked to, they weren't sure uh, of the occupancy of the house, even though there was cars there. I know neighbors were calling around asking to see if they knew where they were at. However, one of the firefighters I talked to a few weeks ago stated that shortly after that, you knew that the house was occupied by the smell
Wow.
of, and that's one of those things when you smell it, you don't forget it. And
Okay.
that was how they knew there was at least someone in the house during the
Okay.
fire.
And that does bring us to the next topic, of course, now going into April 4th, the next day. Of course, they're going to search. And what did they find?
Well, it was over a matter of a day or so too, where the state fire marshal had told the firefighters that the best thing to do was just let the house burn to ash because it would be easier to go through the house. They removed some of the heavier appliances and things like that were in there, and they sifted through all of the ash in a very structured manner. Um, the fire marshal was explaining to some of the firemen, though, they could tell by where you found things in the layers of the ash about where they were actually positioned in the house when everything happened. Um, it was during this time that they actually found the remains of Brian. All that was left was basically the upper torso, upper part of the torso, and the head, the shoulders. They also found remains of a small dog, the bones of a small dog in the house. One thing that was noted, they went through it. They found coins and stuff in the fire, but one of the firemen noted that the unusual thing is they didn't find any kind of zippers or buttons or anything like that from clothing, which was kind of unusual. They would have expected to find remnants of something like that, being that they actually went through to the point where they found coins and stuff inside the
So
fire.
metal objects, not the fire's not hot enough to melt metal objects like coins and things. Maybe cheaper metal things, but coins, of course, high quality metal, not burned. And I think the point they're making is that there are things that are in houses that are a combination of fabric and metal, and of course the fabric would burn, but the metal wouldn't, such as suitcases or something. But they didn't find anything like that.
And I think too, you're looking at the house. There's varying uh, heat within the house because you looked at Brian's body.
Yeah.
We're only finding the upper torso, but yet we found the skeletal remains of a small dog.
The
So you
whole
probably had
remain.
different
Yeah.
heat in different portions of the house. And I'm not an expert on anything like that, but it seems strange though that they didn't find anything. They expected to find more sifting through the fire than what they actually found.
Okay. Now, like you said, though, Brian, at least half of him is found. The skeletal remains of a dog are found, but of course, Bernard and Peggy not found. The remains are not found. For example, of course, the being that I just have to ask this: any of their clothes inside? Any signs that, for example, that anyone was trying to actually fight the fire while it was happening? What can you say about any of that?
Like I said, there was no no remnants of clothing or anything like that they actually found in the fire. I think if I don't know if you want to step back to the fire a little bit.
Go ahead.
Um, when you look, the fire started in the from the first report of it around 11 o'clock.
Yeah.
Noted in the northern corner of the basement, they could be seen through the basement window. However, when the car full of kids came up, who also stated it was around 11 o'clock, the roof line of the house in the upstairs window also had flames in them.
Hmm.
We're only talking a matter of a few minutes here. So I know the older house constructions, so a fire set or oriented in the basement, old house construction, or what they call balloon construction, that they didn't have any, there was a hollow void between the interior and the exterior wall. Nowadays, they'll build that and they'll have required to have fire breaks in there to prevent this exact thing from happening. So odds are that fire in the basement traveled up inside the walls. So you note that the kids, Tony, when he looked in the house, didn't see anything on the main floor involved.
Hmm.
Just noted the doorknobs were hot, but he didn't see anything involved. So the fire would have probably more than likely traveled through the interior of the wall to the roof line of the house, taking the path of least resistance. And that's why you see a lot of those cases that the attic will get involved in that fire. And we saw that here too, where a matter of a few minutes later, we've got a fire in the attic or in the ceiling. And then by the time the fire department responded, mind you, there was a small department, the house was virtually engulfed. So you get the fire comes up through the walls, goes into the void of the attic, probably travels back across over in the heat and ends up engulfing the house.
So I guess what you're saying is it's possible if you have a three-story house or a two-story house with a basement that a fire could start in the basement, and actually the second story would catch fire first before the first story. So you'd have
In
a
those
space conceivably.
houses with most construction, it was quite common, and
Okay.
they were uh, quite dangerous. That's one of the things we learned about when I went through training and stuff is
Hmm.
balloon construction.
Okay.
It was called back then.
All right, so thank you for that. Thank you for explaining that. So, still, Bernard and Peggy, of course, once they did go through the house, bones are found for Brian, bones are found for the dog. No remains are found of Bernard and Peggy. But given where Brian's remains were found, could they deduce where he might have been before the fire ever started or during the fire? Did it look, for example, that he was trying to escape? Was he found like near a door? Do we any idea regarding any of that?
Well, I recently kind of found out through a couple of firefighters I interviewed. Um, Brian's body, like I said, it was just basically the shoulders, the upper part of the torso, and the head. Were found in a, a root cellar in the basement,
Huh.
which was cemented off where they assumed was like kind of a root cellar off to the side of the basement, the dark place where they store potatoes and stuff like that. Now, I do have a very rough diagram that somebody drew of how the house was laid out.
Mhm.
It could have been, it's not noted anywhere in the fire report about where the remains were found in regards to the ashes.
Mhm.
It could be possible that where they had Brian sleeping in the upstairs, that the floor may have collapsed and
Right.
Brian's remains ended up in this part of the basement.
Sure.
So it's all speculation. There was nothing stated about, we were talking about the layers of ash where they were in the house. So
Mhm.
this is just things I gathered from the firefighters that were on scene. Nothing is actually really noted about that stuff or even actually where it was in the house.
All right. So nothing could concretely be deduced as to whether, for example, Brian was trying to escape, where he was, did he die of smoke inhalation or anything else? We really don't. We still don't know that information.
No, that's something too. The only thing stated in the medical examiner's report that Brian seemed to be wrapped in a blanket or a tablecloth,
Hmm.
um, was wrapped around his body and burnt away. Um, so I doubt he was awake at any time, but there wasn't any lung tissue left because if we would have had that, we could have determined that if there was smoke inhalation,
Sure.
after the fire died. If there wasn't
Right.
smoke inhalation, that something
Right.
happened to him prior to the fire.
Right.
So that we was undetermined, or it couldn't be
Right.
determined at that time.
I guess maybe to use another example, maybe an example that maybe many people will remember from how long ago was this? Many years ago, that the band Great White had this concert, this little concert in a bar in Rhode Island, and of course it was a horrendous fire there due to pyrotechnics that caught the insulation on fire, and like 50, many 50 some people or even more got killed, and of course most of those bodies were found near these two exits or an exit, people trying to leave. Well, they all got crowded up there. They all kind of stuck themselves in this doorway, and they all died of smoke inhalation. Of course, that could be determined, being that all their remains were found in this particular area. What you're saying here is that kind of thinking could not be used for where Brian was found in this house that was burned down.
Yeah, it wasn't near the front door. The front door would have been he would have been found on the what would have been the back side of the house away from the front door. However, I believe there was another uh, screen type door on the main floor going out the other direction.
Okay.
But just the indication that he was wrapped in something would probably mean that he didn't uh, wasn't conscious maybe at the time the fire happened, meaning that he was still wrapped.
Right. And the
No.
thing is, I'm thinking, I remember those old fire safety commercials from like the 1990s and 80s that if you're trying to escape a house, wrap, put like a blanket or something over your head. Maybe he was attempting to do that. Maybe.
Yeah, it was well, just struck them unusual though, is that it seemed to be wrapped.
Okay, it
But
was
I'm
wrapped in
thinking
contrast to okay.
the only thing I was thinking about that possibly would be, if um, kid falls asleep on the couch with a blanket, you wrap him up in the blanket, carry him upstairs, lay him on bed. That was
Yeah.
a possible scenario of how I was thinking something like that could have taken place.
Okay. And as far as, of course, you already mentioned the vehicles. I guess they had two cars. These two cars were not damaged by this fire, even though they were parked out front.
No, and the fire didn't seem to spread much beyond the actual physical house itself. The shed I talked about that was used for like gun repair and stuff was probably maybe 50 feet away from the house. And
Mm-hmm.
then the tree with the swing in it was relatively close to the corner of the house as well. And
They never
none of
caught
that.
fire at all.
I mean, I imagine there was some singeing of the upper branches and things like that. It was that close enough for that,
Okay.
but nothing on the exterior was. Everything else, like the pump house and the barn, the garage, were relatively distant from the house. I mean, as far as something jumping over to them.
Okay. Just some questions for you, and I think maybe being that you are involved in firefighting you might be able to help us with this. In 2022, does the public know, or is there any paperwork regarding the actual cause of the fire? What started the fire in that house? Do we know?
Well, we do have the fire state fire marshal's report, which basically gives a overview of what happened to the house and the type of property it was and some of his notes from the scene. There was
Mm-hmm.
nothing noted in that report as far as the source uh, and at the end of the report he said that since there was a fatality and there were suspicious circumstances, they were going to turn it over to the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and then things to be determined later. There's nothing in the BCA report that states any kind of origin of the fire. I did call the state fire marshal's office, and no records from that long ago have been retained at all. Um, the gentleman I talked to was knew the state fire marshal that wrote the report, Rusty Tallman, and he had good things to say about character and his ability as a state fire marshal. But no, nothing was ever referenced to the source of the fire or any speculation about the fire itself. So this is just where I'm going on things that stick out to me. So I'm not an arson investigator by any means, but I think when you start looking at things, there's a common sense that goes to it.
Okay. I'll just bring there is no A word. In any of the paperwork that you ever heard, has the word arson ever come up?
Not that I can recall directly. It may have been mentioned. The M word, murder, has come up
Okay.
several times, which I kind of find it's kind of funny because when I was trying to get records, I got great help from the Becker County Sheriff's Office and the like. But I went to the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, bringing the same case there. I wanted to get their files, copy of the files, and they said basically, take a hike. This is a murder investigation, and we aren't going to give you anything, even though by law they were supposed to. I figured I'm not going to sit and I could get the records via the family, so I wasn't going to get into a standoff with the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. So I kind of gave up that aspect of it. But see, the murder thing was brought up too when I was trying to retrieve the records. And I had to point out that murder is just conjecture because there was actually no physical, it's an assumption and maybe a safe assumption as well, but there was nothing physically that said, through the medical examiner's office, they x-rayed and did different tests on the remains to see if there was any metal or bullet fragments, anything like that. And they couldn't find anything concluding a cause of death that they could nail down. So
so we're not. I guess what I'm asking you is there anything in any of the paperwork you said that read that says that this fire was planned, that it was set?
No, not that I actually saw.
Okay.
I think there's assumptions, but nothing that I saw stated in there. I think when you start going through later documents, when you start looking in hindsight and conjecture, things are probably brought up, but not initially.
Okay. And all I'm interested in is the investigation that was done on the fire. As far as you know, the paperwork you've ever been found that is official, nothing has ever been stated. Yes, we believe this fire was intentionally set.
No, nothing there.
Okay. Because, of course, listeners of Unfound, we have a lot of experience in this area. Dorian Myers' house and car set on fire on purpose. The Freeman's trailer set fire on purpose. Jeremy Burt's car set on fire on purpose, and for sure. Whereas with this, very well may be so, but it's not. There's nothing, even though there was an investigation done, nothing in the paperwork that you've been able to find. I'm not saying it doesn't exist; you just haven't found it yet.
That's correct. I don't think the fire, from what it looks like, the fire itself, the investigation of the fire never progressed that far.
Okay.
It turned right away into the deceased boy and the missing.
I guess the thing is that eventually they would figure out that the two adults aren't there. Maybe they thought that they died in the fire and their remains got turned to ash. But surely I would hope that somebody in a position to investigate this or know a little bit about this would know that the human body cannot be burned that easily. I mean, we have the remains of a full dog that's left behind. What are the odds that a human's remains, are going to be burned up? But that does lead me to the question: as best you can tell, looking at all this paperwork, what do the investigators think happened? And at that point, being that Bernard and Peggy's remains were not found in the remains, was an APB put out for them? A be on the lookout for anything like that? As to far as trying to find the parents of this boy who died in the fire, any of that? What can you say about all that?
Since all the vehicles and everything were still in the house, there was no, because of the driveway, there was no indication that anybody had gone in or out of the farm place prior to the kids pulling up there in the car. I know the next day they had searched the property surrounding there. I can't remember the perimeter, but there was a creek down the road. They searched the meadows, the nearby woods, across the woods, thinking that maybe the house was on fire and they tried fleeing the house. They're maybe injured, laying out in a field someplace, or deceased in the field someplace. So that was the initial thing. And like with Milda, I don't think anybody jumps to uh, that conclusion right off the bat. I mean, you want to be a little skeptical, and Murphy's well, what's the most likely thing? Ours most likely thing is they didn't just run away. Something they've got to be laying out here someplace. So I think that's the thing where you didn't start going to where the parents go as far as a mystery. It's like trying to find out where exactly, did they run from the house? Did they fall in here? They were there. Um, is kind of where they went that first part. So you didn't start looking at it as a real investigation initially, I think.
When would you say that eventually happened? I mean, how long did it take? I mean, I can understand, maybe they're thinking maybe right away, right at that second. Well, there's a fire, and maybe the parents, maybe something happened, and they had to leave their son at home, and they had to take a car somewhere, even though all both cars are there, but they might not know that. At some point, they have to think, though, that the parents are going to come back. Of course, they
Well, I think
didn't. So it would seem to me that they'd start thinking, well, what's going on here? And can you tell from any of the paperwork what their insight was into Bernard and Peggy at the time when they didn't come back?
I think that's when well, it was shortly after they established that nobody was in the woods and stuff
Hmm.
surrounding the house that they're starting to go, okay, what's going on here? All the
Yeah.
cars are here. So then they went out and started interviewing people who are acquainted with them, looking into the background and what they might have been doing. One of the friends that they talked to, who at the time was quoted to be Bernard's best friend, he also owned a body shop in another part of northern Minnesota. um, told He's one of the people that also mentioned the thing about the bid ringing, but he said that Bernard was a very paranoid guy,
Hmm.
and that he would have never left the hood of the car open. Apparently, the keys were left in a padlock to the pump house, which Bernard was the type that would lock doors behind him. And for him
Okay.
to leave the keys in the ignitions of the cars, the hood up, the doors of the outbuildings open, was very out of character for him.
Okay.
So then they started, then you start looking at a little bit more of trying to figure out what happened that night.
Okay.
Um,
Anything in the paperwork that would lead you to like any insight into the investigators' thoughts regarding all of this, suspecting Peggy and Bernard as being responsible for this? Is there anything in any writing that you've seen where they thought, maybe reading between the lines, they suspected this was done by Peggy and Bernard together?
I don't think there was so much to it. I don't think they ever um, written on paper. I found out there's things that they didn't necessarily write down that weren't real pertinent, but more opinion wise. Nothing that was written down stating, "Hey, I really think they did something here." In
Okay.
interviewing things, uh, it was said that maybe he had some mafia stuff that they came after him because of
Yeah, we're
somebody
not.
else.
All I'm asking you is anything in the paperwork, anything.
Nothing that would go down stating anything specifically.
Okay. All right, so we have this situation. The fire happens. Young boy's found. He's deceased. His parents are nowhere to be found, even though both of their cars, we'll get into the cars a little bit later here, but the parents are missing. Maybe the fire was an accident. Maybe it was on purpose. All we know is that the parents of this son never came home. They've never been tracked down. Of course, they're still missing 46 years later. We don't know the cause of the fire. We don't know if it was arson. We don't know if it was accidental. There's a lot of things that that we still don't know about this fire that I think might be helpful to us in trying to narrow down what could have happened in this disappearance. So let's now jump into a lot of these things in a little more technical detail. But I know maybe for the listeners, this is going to be a weird place to start. But let's talk about dogs because, of course, we've already talked about there was a dog that was found deceased in the house. But my understanding is there were two dogs that were found locked in the barn that is mentioned in one of these reports, and then there were dogs that were outside that somebody actually saw running around near the house. How many dogs did Bernard and Peggy have? How many dogs were found at the scene? How do we make sense of this? It just seems like there's a lot more dogs on the scene than Bernard and Peggy had. Am I missing something here?
I'm not positive. Now, in that carload of kids that pulled up at 11 o'clock when the house was, they tried to get entry into the house and shut off the gas. One of the women that was in the car stated in her statement that she got out of the car, two dogs approached her, and she remembers soothing them, scratching them on the head, scratching their ears, and then going up to see if she could assist with the house fire.
Okay.
Doesn't come across in and of itself as strange, but in a statement taking in a cold case investigation, one of the firefighters who was on scene stated in this in his interview that one of the things he recalls is when he got out to the farm, he found two dogs locked inside the barn.
Huh.
I haven't been able to find the woman that did this initial report to verify that she did not put them in the barn, but it certainly didn't sound like she did anything with the dogs besides pat their head and walk away.
Right.
So we got two dogs that somehow got locked in the barn. The dog's remains found in the fire
Yeah.
were of a small dog. I'm not aware of any of the dogs actually. I did talk to somebody who was out there the next day of the fire that was associated with Bernard's eldest son that stated that didn't sound like she knew they had a small dog. She just made an assumption that they did because there was one found in the fire. They ended up taking one dog that they found on the property. There was only one that they knew of, a boxer named Rocky, that they took with them back into Fargo, and she's not sure if it was put up for adoption or anything. So we know about Rocky. We know a small dog that died in the house fire. So where the other dog came from, how this all got taken care of, I have no idea.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of people are going to think, well, there's two dogs that were there. Maybe somebody showed up, and just to make sure the dogs didn't run away, they brought the dogs over to the shed and put them in there just so they wouldn't run away. It could be the same very two dogs. But then we have to start thinking about, well, who would do that? And if the shed was actually locked, well, how would somebody do that if they're, locked the shed, or was the door just shut and not locked? It gets a little, it gets a little confusing.
I'm not sure if it was actually padlocked or if it was just secured to the point where the dogs could not get out of the building. Yeah, it brings up a lot of speculation. The second dog, besides Rocky, could have very well been another farm dog that a lot of times farm dogs will, they live outside, they'll wander across field to a neighboring property. Not unusual. Could have been that. The only thing I found curious about that is when we look back at the fire, how rapidly it moved from just being flames in the window. So, and unless it would have been some kind of type of spontaneous combustion, like an old rag with paint thinner on it, which could have happened, but
Yeah.
in the scenario, more than likely not, because of all the extenuating circumstances involved with this. Just to show with the dogs being locked up again, there very well could have been somebody left on the property between the leaving of when the carload of kids left and the arrival of the fire department. Because the fire did take off and the house was consumed in a relatively short time. So Ian thought that there could be a person that was still on the property that then in the absence of the kids and before the fire department, decided to throw the dogs
Yeah.
in the barn just to get them out of the way too, or so the dogs didn't follow them. So
Yeah, and we
it's
just have
one.
to, we have to wonder, does it make sense that these two dogs would have been outside at night, just roaming around, whilst one dog was inside? This is why I decided to start this kind of like in this spot. The dog situation to me is a bit curious. So
Yeah, the varying stories on them kind of, once I start talking to the fire department too, the guys, I'm like, well, that's kind of weird. This isn't quite adding up,
mhm,
the dog stories.
yeah, okay. The dogs. All right, let's move on to this. Now, you've already stated this, but do this again. You stated that a friend of Bernard says he was a kind of paranoid guy, but there was a shed and the padlock had the keys in it. Is that correct?
Yes, one of the fire department reported that. Keys in the vehicle and then keys left in the padlock opened on, it was either the gun shed or the pump house. I think I've heard the pump house more than the gun shed.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said, it was unusual for him because he was a person that by the time the sun went down, he would have all the buildings locked up and secured and the keys back in the
Right.
house.
I think it's just on its face, maybe you can see something being left unlocked, but just to actually leave the keys in the lock, I don't know how many people do that. People usually carry their keys for things on them, for something like a padlock. They just don't leave it in the lock. Maybe Bernard was different or Peggy was different.
And you never know if you have padlocks on all your buildings, maybe you leave it in the last padlock so you don't misplace them somewhere and I guess I could maybe see that a little bit where there wasn't. It was out in the middle of the country where nobody's going to wander down the street and come up and see the keys hanging there. But it's something definitely you would have secured things up and taken them back with you too.
Yes. All right, so we have these keys that are in this padlock, and now we're going to talk about the vehicles. The keys were left in the vehicles, but maybe more importantly, the hood was still open on this particular, was it a truck or a Bronco or some type of old school SUV, and was Bernard working on it?
What I gathered is that Bernard was working on either putting a sounded like a PA system in the truck underneath the hood. There was a couple things stereo, and there was stuff about a CD, but CB. I don't know. You remember? I don't know how redneck you were back when you were a kid, but when you get out in the country here, everybody had the CB in their
Oh
truck.
yeah, no, I know.
Also,
We
a
didn't have one,
dial.
but my next door neighbor out there in Gilpin Township, outside of Leechburg, he had his own CB antenna. He would talk to truckers going through the area. Yeah, I know all
There's
about that.
usually a button, dial on there that says PA. So since the radio itself had the ability, people would go wire a speaker underneath their hood too, so they could use it as a PA system too. That's what I'm imagining. Uh, Bernard was probably doing in conjunction with the CB radio, putting in some speakers underneath the hood to, take full advantage of his CB.
Okay. And so what you're saying is when those kids showed up, when the witnesses showed up, when the fire department showed up, the vehicles are there, but the hood is up on this particular vehicle and the keys are in them.
That's what they found out later. The kids didn't bother to go look
Hmm.
inside the cars. They were basically focused on the house.
Yeah.
They were conscious enough to shut off the LP tank going into the house, hopefully prevent an explosion from the inside type thing. And they
Okay.
also noted that one of the witnesses noticed that there was no explosion because, or she noted that all the windows in the house were still intact. So it's not like there was an explosion that,
Mhm.
a gas explosion in the basement or something that blew the windows out. So that was,
Okay.
I'm surprised she was aware enough to know.
Okay. So, and you did notice, maybe this is something notable before, is that you stated when those kids got there, the person went up to the front door and tried to open it, and he said the door was locked.
Yep, the door to the house was locked because he wanted to go in and check because if anyone was in the house or yell inside the house and see if anybody was there. Like he said, when he looked through the window, there was nothing on the main floor involved at that time. but the door was locked and he couldn't make entry into the house.
Okay, so we have a shed that has a lock on it, but the key is in the lock. We have two cars that are out front with the keys in them and the hood's up on one, but the front door to the house is locked.
Yes.
Okay. Let's move on to this. The driveway. We've talked about it being harrowed, being plowed so that it would drain or dry properly to be nice and smooth again. But you stated, as far as anybody could tell or remember, no extra tire tracks, no footprints, anything like that. Outside, of course, these teenagers showing up. There's going to be tire tracks or footprints there, but nothing that they could tell that anybody had been there other than the witnesses. What can you say about that?
I spoke with the driver. I spoke with 3 of the 5 people in that vehicle. And Tony, the guy who was driving the car, stated that he was a little leery because as he was driving up the driveway, he almost got stuck because the gravel was so soft. And he noted that there had been nobody else driving on that driveway as they drove up because the tire tracks would have been pretty obvious. So since the driveway had been harrowed, they were the first vehicle to traverse the driveway in or out
Okay.
since they had actually been plowed up.
And nothing that could tell that anybody had been on that property. At least
Nothing obvious.
nothing obvious. At least anybody had been on the property after this driveway had been plowed.
Correct.
Okay. I guess what it also would mean is even if we were talking about Bernard and Peggy leaving, there wasn't any tire tracks for anything they could have been driving either.
Exactly. That's the
Seemingly. Okay. Let's move on to this. We've kind of talked about this already. You've already stated that one of the things that the firefighters, when they went in there, they found it odd that they found coins and very hard metallic objects that don't melt under normal house fire. But their opinion was that other things that they would expect to find in this type of fire were not found. But is there anything that has been proven to have been not there that should have been anything, for example, that was stolen? Anything that was missing once somebody who would be in a position to know, maybe Peggy's brother or somebody went in there, and noticed anything was missing. For example, in the shed, in this gun repair shed, where these dogs were found, in the cars, even stuff like that. Any possessions missing, anything like that.
well, they did find there were several guns in the house, and they did find remains of those guns because there was issues going on with the insurance where they
Yeah.
could identify what guns were left in the house. I believe
Okay.
there was guns in the outbuilding as well as repair shop. Um, there was Bernard's son, his eldest son, had stuff stored out there. Nothing that was stated taken at that time. I know later on, as the house stood empty, there was reports of people breaking into the barn and stuff like that
Yeah.
to take things. But no, there was nothing noted offhand that was actually taken away from the farm that night.
Okay. And once again, you stated though that in the firefighters' opinion, even though it doesn't sound to me like they knew Peggy and Bernard that well, in their opinion, having showed up at other fires, house fires, surely over the years, their opinion was that they thought that they would find things in the fire that they didn't.
Essentially, yes, there'd be a little more signs of habitation,
Okay.
clothes, suitcase, things like that that you might find that wouldn't completely burn. You can tell, I mean, there'd be varying degrees of the fire, the heat of the fire.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I did talk, one of the firefighters speculated that they couldn't find any limbs left from Brian. And I did talk to the state fire investigator about that, and he said that's not totally unusual with the heat of fire nowadays with some of the um, plastics and things like that, that it could become hot enough to incinerate the legs and stuff like that, some of the fatty tissue things. Um, so we've got heat enough in one area of the house that obviously destroyed a large portion of Brian's remains. then in another portion of the house, we have heat that wasn't strong enough that it actually left the full skeleton of a small dog.
Okay.
So there's varying, you can tell there's varying temperatures in the area of the house. And another thing with Brian being that the remains were found in that root cellar, you're looking at a cement walled area of the house, kind of like an old cistern type area, where that could have actually turned more into an oven type thing as the fire burned down too. So that might explain higher temperatures over there.
Yeah, and I guess continue on this fire idea. It just doesn't sound to me like this fire burned very long.
They left it burn long enough to burn the house to ash,
Mm-hmm.
or because they knew at that time there was remains in the house
Mm-hmm.
because of the smell. So that's when they turned out, and the fire marshal suggested rather than putting it out, it's going to be a lot easier and less hazardous to search when you leave the house burned to basically an ash. Like I said, one part of a wall was left standing, and he said it's going to be much easier than having to remove debris out of the house. And that's his explanation. The firefighters is that when you go through the process of sorting the ashes and sifting, you're going to be able to tell whereabouts things were located as the level of the house by where it falls into the ashes. So that was the explanation given to me.
Okay. Now, here's a disputed story. I don't know what to make of it, but there was a skull found in the fire that was not Brian's, but it's a disputed story. You've gotten two different versions of this. Why don't you give both versions to the audience?
There was a skull found in the house. This was actually, I think, while the fire was still going, they spotted this. A aunt of Peggy's stated in a letter to some of the detectives or investigators, she didn't live in the area at all, but she said that Peggy's mother had given her a skull that was used as a planter. That was a story that came from there. And you know what? Quite honestly, I never paid a lot of attention to it. You'd think a skull in a fire, especially me. Um, but I never paid a lot of attention to it. And later on, due to it for another reason, I ended up talking to Peggy's sister out in Seattle, who was in the area at the time of the fire, and she told me and brought it up to me that she wanted to note that her mother never and would never give a person a human skull, as a gift. Right. She said her mother would faint the sight of a pulled tooth, and she thought that was the most ridiculous thing ever said. And she stated that her aunt was being a busybody and wanted to inject herself into the story. So it was funny because she brought that up to me. I never mentioned the skull at all in our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So
I gotta ask, so are we saying this is a real human skull, or is this just something that's made like of, I don't know, cement or porcelain? I don't know. I don't know what even they make this stuff off of. Pot and metal, or what? What are we saying here, being regarding the skull? It's a real human. It was a real one way or the other. It was in the remains. Was it a real human skull, like of some dead person, or was it just a fake?
It was a real human skull. Forensically wise, when they were trying to remove it, a lot of the skull fell apart because of the heat and the fire.
Mm-hmm.
But there were remnants of the skull. There it was a human skull. But you have to realize too, back in the days where people would find Native American burial grounds or things like that, or things when they're out working fields, they might inadvertently have tilled something up, and they took souvenirs. I mean, there was a lot of farmers and stuff that actually collected Native American relics and kept them in their house, bring them out and things like that. So, I mean, it's not totally out of the question. It's still wondering how it happened to be out there. So it's still kind of a mystery as to why, but it's not, I would say it's not totally out of the question.
But I guess what I'm saying, conceivably, this could have been Bernard's or Peggy's skull. Conceivably.
Yeah, I think they eliminated that because of there was nothing else found in that area. The only thing that was there was no vertebrae. There was
Okay.
no other bones found there.
Okay.
And the coroner, when they went through the remains and stuff like that, he stated, I'm not sure his whole process, but he stated unquestionably that there was only one set of human remains in that house.
Okay. That's a crazy story, though. Here we have a young a boy who died. His remains are found, and an additional skull is found, but we do not believe it is the skull of anybody else who lived in the house. It doesn't get any more unique than that, as you know, Joe. With the work you've done, you surely it's just weird. All right, let's move on to this. And I have to bring this up because we, of course, have covered at least one disappearance, Andrea Bowman, where she was murdered by her father, Dennis, because of allegations that he had made against, I think that's the reason. But we now know that he really did murder her and buried her in the backyard. So we have to be at least open to the idea that maybe Peggy and Bernard did something to their son for whatever reason. Anything that you have ever read in working on this for 4 years about anything that Brian ever said is about his parents that had anything to do with abuse? Did he ever say anything to anybody at school? Anything like that?
No, everything I've heard about Brian, that he was a very quiet kid that kept to himself. Um, I'm not to make anything out, but I'm almost maybe to the verge of autistic spectrum,
Huh.
maybe. I can't
Okay.
say that for sure. I'm just saying from some of the things I heard, how quiet he was. They never went into it that much. I did talk to somebody that uh, interacted with the family on occasions with the Brian and the mom. There was really, like I said, I've been trying to find out where Brian exactly went to school just to see if I could explore things about Brian a little bit more. Nobody ever brought up anything about any kind of abuse in any of the relationships between mom and dad or dad and child or anything like that. They just, the only thing to that extent, they thought that Bernard and Brian felt a little distant from each other in the interactions that some of the people witnessed.
Okay.
So nothing ever brought up or
All
anything
right.
like that.
So I guess what we're saying is, at least publicly, anything that anybody's been able to find, there doesn't seem to be appear to be any reason that, for example, Peggy and Bernard would have wanted to kill their son and like get away and cover it all up by burning their house down. There's no allegations to think that they would have done that. Any
Not
accusations
that
against them?
No,
No.
we know it's not impossible. It's been done in the past, but there was
It
nothing
certainly has,
there.
but we don't have any information. Unlike once
Nothing.
again with Andrea Bowman's, where it was very public that she had made accusations against her father Dennis before she went missing, and we now know that she was murdered. Okay, let's move on to this. Now let's talk a little bit more. We'll get back to Bernard and Peggy and the two of them. Let's revisit this fixed contract bit, and we've already talked about it. And your belief is that yes, this fixing did work, but how did this story? This seems to me, my perception is this is something that you really want to keep on the down low, behind the scenes. Nobody should ever know about this that it happened. Why is this even known? How did you even get paperwork to verify that this actually happened? Because it seems to me that Peggy would want to keep that a secret. The person who was giving this bribe, which is essentially what it is, would want to keep it secret. How did this even come out?
I don't think it was probably viewed as that big of a deal, maybe by them. I think it was told to friends. Um, the only thing I have in there, it was brought up a couple times about friends mentioning it and the detectives asking people about it in another interview. And it seemed to be known amongst peers outside of work. Like I said, Bernard, it was mentioned by Bernard to a friend, and Bernard said he didn't play that way. But then in another statement, it gave specifics of where the company was from, the amount of money that exchanged hands. And
Huh.
the detectives asked about it, so I'm not sure there's some vague things in there where they actually initially heard it to start asking the questions about it.
I guess what we're saying, I guess what you're saying then is, Joey, is it doesn't seem that Peggy and Bernard were doing a very good job of keeping this a secret. They were just freely talking about it.
Well, I think to close friends, and I don't think it
Yeah.
was something they felt was maybe that big of a deal at the time.
Okay.
It might depends on your perspective in the story about the guy who was the initial highest bidder probably would have taken it a little bit differently than
Yeah.
some people. But
This does sound. It does sound like some crime is being committed there. It
I
does.
think he's probably not as uh, they probably didn't take it as that big of a deal, maybe because of the circumstances with it, that they
Okay.
obviously talked to friends about it. And
All right.
so
Okay. So, all right. So it doesn't seem like this was a secret. They were talking about it, but it just doesn't seem like people thought it was that big of a deal. I have to admit.
I don't think they told everyone. I think there was some close friends that the story might have got exchanged with. So I don't think they're real open about it because I'm sure there'd be plenty of people that if it was known publicly that it would have came back to.
Okay. So people will have to think about that. To what degree do they think that this is a serious crime or not? Moving on. We've already kind of touched upon this, but we'll try to go a little deeper with it. Was Bernard cheating on Peggy, and how is this even known? Where did this story start, and who was the woman?
There was a woman that was questioned
Okay.
uh, after the fact, a married woman that stated that she had had a relationship with Bernard uh, in the early 70s before he went to the cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and because it was just noted in there that she wasn't even aware he was back in town.
Hmm.
They had talked to her about and how they actually found out that they had a relationship to begin with. I have no idea. But that was the one thing mentioned in one of the interviews about uh, him having a relationship with that woman for a time in the earlier 70s, which would have been part of the time that he was with Peggy.
Okay. No allegations, though, that this was continuing in 1976.
No, the woman stated that she hadn't seen him in 4 years or so and had no idea he was living in the area again.
All right. And I think, although I have to say, I think people are going to probably read between the lines on this and hearing how many kids that Bernard had and how many different women. And, maybe they're going to think maybe there was some other woman anyway that we just don't know about. Maybe there was another woman in 75, 76. No proof of that. But given his reputation and, maybe even Peggy being that she had been cheating on her husband with Bernard, maybe that was going both ways. Okay. Now, you've also given me some paperwork shown me some paperwork that you've collected regarding, of course, Bernard worked at this car dealership in the body shop area, and there was an allegation or actual proof that a car, to go back to the 1970s vehicles, a Chevrolet Vega, which in retrospect would probably be the worst choice of a car to ever steal. But was there a car stolen from where Bernard worked, and where did this story originate? What can you say about it?
Well, that was found in a different part of the document, but it initiated with me is that there was a sighting. Bernard had a glass eye, which was kind of noticeable when you looked at him.
Mm-hmm.
There was a sighting in Moorhead, Minnesota, where a woman stated that she saw someone that looked to be Bernard Rusness because of the wire rim glasses, the distinguishing eye. And the reason she even looked is that her kids were staring at the guy because he had kind of a odd eye. And she reported that at the time he was driving a Vega station wagon with wood grain siding on it. And it was curious because Peggy's sister had lived in Moorhead, probably about 10 blocks from where this sighting had taken place. That's why I reached out to her originally
Mm-hmm.
to find out that if she had actually um, seen Bernard, if Bernard and Peggy were stopping at her house then, being maybe they were alive. Um, but I found out later in some side notes that with this sighting in a Vega, that a couple weeks prior to the disappearance, a 1972 Vega went missing from the car dealership that Bernard worked at.
Huh.
There's no real disposition or report on it, but it was just taken in the notes that this was a couple weeks prior to that.
Okay.
So
So it was
just
not it was not a new 1976 Vega if they even made them that year. It was a used one from 1972.
yeah, it was a 72. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe so we know how it's unfound how we feel about eyewitness accounts. So I don't know what to make of this woman, but maybe just more importantly that there was a vehicle that was stolen from where Bernard worked not too long before this all happened.
Exactly.
All
That's
right.
just,
And
it is what it is. There's just some
okay.
things that
Okay. Now, the listeners should know that Joe and I have gone through a lot of stories, and me as the host, it's always my job to keep things as concise as possible. I think Joe and I could sit here and talk about people being suspicious of planes, hearing planes overhead at the time, and all sorts of things, and we're just going to have to avoid those for the time being. So I just want to narrow it down to this point. And Joe has his own lot line. He knows this question is coming. What once again his opinion, because we are going to talk about some suspects here very quickly. In your opinion, is there any allegation against either one, either Peggy or Bernard or both, that rises to the level that someone would torch a house, kill their son, and take Bernard and Peggy away? Any allegation so serious against them, anything that they could have been involved in that rises to the level that a person or group would have wanted to do this? And if so, what allegation would that be?
I've never heard anything beyond maybe some. Uh, I'm only speculating that it would be maybe some petty things involved with the, you know, car insurance and auto body type things, and
Yeah.
there's nothing that I could even think of. I mean, honestly, besides for maybe a Mexican drug cartel, I mean, who's going to do something like that? Who would have the kid? I mean, really, when you look at that, who would be angry enough to and resourceful enough to leave a kid to die in the house but take the parents away?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the ultimately all the things we've talked about, all these scenarios and stuff like that. You still can't make any sense of actually what happened, but why do it this
Right.
way?
So
So no,
once
there's
again, we're saying, and keep in mind, I mean, just within the last, what was it, 5 years, we did have this story out of Ohio where a bunch of people in one family were killed. I think there were 9 different people killed between children and adults, and they suspected it was a Mexican cartel because they were involved in growing marijuana illegally in there. But it eventually found out that it was another family that did it because they were all ticked off because something had happened between the daughter and a son in that other family, and it ended up being a family thing. But that was figured out fairly quickly. I mean, to kill 9 people in a family, 3 different locations, or what it was, this came out very quickly. But here we are, 46 years later, and you being an expert on this disappearance, still trying to figure out if this was what happened, that somebody did go in there and take them and kill their son. There's just nothing that makes sense that any allegation would cause somebody to do that.
yeah. I mean, if you had any scenario, if you had something against Bernard and you wanted to get rid of him, uh, taking them away from the house and letting the boy die in the fire just draws more attention to itself.
Yeah.
There's so many
Right.
things that wouldn't.
Okay.
Uh,
So I guess what we're saying is maybe it's still possible now, but I think after 46 years, nobody has come across what that might have been. And of course, we might even just be open to the idea that Bernard and Peggy did this all on their own for some reason, which we may get into before we're done here as well. Okay, next question. Anything once again, you talking to some of the family members, you doing your own work. Anything that changed in Peggy and Bernard's life right before that disappearance? For example, financial trouble, impending criminal charges, foreclosures? Were they going to get caught, doing something that was much worse than fixing a bid? Anything that has ever popped up that anybody's told you?
Nothing that's ever uh, came up. There was no, they had owned some land, but they were going to build a cabin on or some land along the lake that they're almost paid off on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, they didn't have, they looked at their credit card statements and stuff. Nothing really uh, outstanding amount of money owed anywhere. They had money in their bank account that would have been maybe ample to survive the way they, their standard of living. Nothing that ever came up as far as that. I mean, we've speculated. There's a couple of routes that I've gone down or veering away from uh, for possible motives. Um, One of them might maybe be some kind of fraudulent activity a little bit beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
But there was nothing that's outstanding, that would pop out that either the prior investigators or I've ever found that would make it kind of a no-brainer.
And I think we have to remember something else. We're so caught up in talking about human remains and everything else. Being that you brought up that Bernard had a glass eye, if depending on what kind of high quality the glass eye would have been, it wouldn't burn in a fire either, and that would be something once you're sifting through things that you think you would run across, right?
Yeah, I never thought of it that way, but yeah, that would be something you'd come across and big enough.
Think. Yeah, so if we're open to the idea that something happened and Peggy and Bernard got caught in the basement trying to put out a fire. They died, and somehow their remains got charred and turned to ash. This glass eye that he had, I think there's a decent possibility maybe that it would have survived the fire once again because it's glass. And how is glass made? Glass is made with fire, and you'd think it would survive it, especially afterwards when they're going through and sifting through anything. So maybe that's something for everybody to think about as well. Okay. Now let's talk about um, some suspects because once again, I think we have to do this because to think about the alternative maybe might just be a little too much for us to stand. But we're not saying we believe these things, but just to talk about some names that have come up over the years. For some reason, a sheriff's deputy has been a popular boogeyman in all of this. How did this even come up? What would you say about this?
I was a deputy that lived not too far away from the fire where the fire happened. Um, he responded to the fire afterwards. There's some various varying stories about how long he was there and what he did out there. But I think we get down to the point where it's there was rumors that this deputy might have had something to do with it, maybe some infidelity, things like that. He held a grudge over something. Um,
Hmm.
there's nothing really to substantiate any of it. And at a later time, he did pass a polygraph. At the time, excuse me, at the time he took it, he had no idea that there was even rumors about him going around.
Huh. Did
I've
not
talked
even
to
know.
some
Like,
people that I've talked to people that would swear he had something to do with it. I also
yeah,
talked to
I know you
people
have.
that are some of his uh, biggest advocates. I think most of it seems to be more barroom speculation type thing. I have the feeling he's one of those guys that either you liked him or you hated him. One of those personalities. So I've definitely seen both.
Okay.
But there's nothing to substantiate that he had any kind of involvement with it. There was a polygraph. The cold case investigators interviewed him about that very topic, also stating that he had no clue that people had actually suspected him of doing anything.
Okay.
Um,
Now you, though, much more recently have had a chance to ask actually police in the area about this, and what have they said?
they were quite confident that he had. they warned me about the people bringing that up to me,
Mm-hmm.
and they said that there's absolutely nothing to substantiate it, and it was basically because Clarence, the deputy, was from that town, and everybody in that area knew him and had their opinions of him. But everybody, even walking into it, the county investigators and the cold case investigator from the BCA told me that they don't believe that he had absolutely anything to do with it, and there's nothing to substantiate that he did.
Okay. So let's just move on to this. Everyone knows how I feel about prisoner confessions and saying they know things about disappearances. But there are some people who went through enough bother to even write letters. Let's talk about those letters. I've seen them, and maybe by the time everybody sees us or hears our voices, they will have been posted so people can read them for themselves. I've called them the cult letter and the pastor letter. Let's talk about the cult letter first. Please summarize it. When was it written? Who wrote it? What can you say about that letter, Joe?
There was a letter written by an inmate addressed to the Wolf Lake police chief um, by a guy simply known as Terry M., who was an inmate in North Dakota State Penitentiary in Bismarck. The letter stated something to the extent that he knew a Reverend Bob Warner, who was an exorcist. Mind you, this letter, I think you could probably describe him as simple,
Okay.
author of the letter. He was in prison with a guy named Reverend Bob Warner, who was an exorcist. He stated there was devil worshippers after this Bob Warner. They wanted to kill him, and that they knew about what happened to the boy in Wolf Lake. This letter was written in 78, the fall of 78, I believe.
Okay.
And he went on to say that these devil worshippers went and he said they were also killed and decapitated the pregnant lady from McCluskey in October of 1976, and buried her in different places, and then surmised it by saying they're very dangerous. They've killed 7 people already, and kind of left it at that. Curious thing, I did look into a little bit of that. I did talk to the undersheriff in Sheridan County, where McCluskey is, and he did some digging and stuff, and he's not aware of any woman that disappeared in McCluskey in October of 1976. Well, there was a response to this letter. The only thing I have is about the agents talking to this Bob Warner. Is a piece of legal paper with some hand jotted notes here and there with some times written down. It appeared that when they talked to Warner, he gave the name of 2 other inmates, and it shows that they talked to those inmates for a very short period of time. I ended up looking into those inmates. They were both involved in the armed robbery of a Fargo pharmacy, hospital pharmacy, and they were in prison for that at the time. I did actually talk to one of them. One's deceased, and I located another one in Minneapolis and talked to him for a little bit. He vaguely remembered Bob Warner. Didn't really recall being talked to about this case at all.
Okay.
Then after that, we have a letter from Bob Warner, Reverend Bob Warner, apologizing to the agents that feeling bad because how could he prove his own innocence if he let the guilty go in this case of the boy from Wolf Lake? And he stated in that letter that he knew someone intimate, one of his very few friends, was involved and had something to do with the boy that died in Wolf Lake in April of 76. And then he went on to state that he also knew who exchanged money on a murder contract for a woman named Holly Guy. So I found a lot of stuff on this Warner. He's still alive. He lives under an alias someplace else. Um, he was a con man. I talked to an ex-wife of his who, speaking of ex-wife, another one that fears their ex-husband extremely.
Yeah.
And he said he was very abusive and I was kind of a shyster. The the whole reverend thing came along as he was in a thrift shop and found a priest collar and he started wearing that and then he started calling
Oh
himself.
my. Oh my goodness.
And I'm sure the story went along with this Terry M, well, I'm a reverend and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
Terry M
Yeah.
seemed simple enough to believe him.
Right. Right. This Holly guy. This was a murder that was unsolved, and is it still unsolved in 2022?
No, it was a living person in a contract that was put out. Now, I often believe that there's even in like a pathological liar, there's always usually an element of truth in every lie. So I started to do some vetting and I found this woman. Um, she was the daughter of the former or the governor of North Dakota back then.
Right.
When I found her living in Minnesota here, I called her up and basically asked her, "Are you aware of?" It's an awkward conversation. Are you aware of anybody putting a murder contract out on you 40 years ago?
Right.
And she's like, "No," but she also told me that she was a confidential informant back then and that she was responsible for putting a lot of people in prison. So, in that, we can say that it's very likely that somebody could have tried to put out some kind of contract on her at one time when they're in prison, and Warner apparently knew about that. Nobody ever went back to talk to Warner because they basically they lied to him. He lied to him once and thought he was full
Yep.
of crap. They weren't going
Yep.
to waste their time anymore.
Still not sure how this could be connected to these disappearances, though.
Well, he states he knows the guy,
Mm-hmm.
Wolf Lake. What's kind of funny though is Wolf Lake, Minnesota, is a relatively small town, and they have some guy in Bismarck, North Dakota, 2 years after the fact. Two guys actually, 2 or 3 years
Right.
after the fact, bring it up about knowing who was responsible for the death of the boy in Wolf Lake, Minnesota. I explored a few of those options. The guy I'd love to talk to the Warner. Like I said, he's living under an alias in another city right now, and I haven't been able to uh, track him down. Or the couple times I might have came close, they uh, kind of shut me down. I did find his son and talk to his son, and verified it was his son through one of the detectives out there, and he stated that he has no clue who the man is, has no clue who his mother is, even though they go under a very unique name right now. And I just kind of left it. It's like, well, I'll tell you what, if you should ever know them, keep my number, keep my name. You can find me on Facebook, whatever, reach back out to me. So up to this point, though, I think I might have talked to his ex-wife, who denied that she was herself. Basically, when the phone was answered, I said, "Yeah, I'm looking for Dorothy," and it's like, "Oh, she doesn't live here. No, bye." And it's like hung up the phone. So
All
that
right. All
there
right.
are
So
some,
we have these two letters, got allegations, people saying they know things, but of course we know all of this is still unsolved 46 years later. Okay, but we had to talk about it because you do have the paperwork on that, and you can post those in the group. I'll post them on the website. People will make the decisions for themselves.
there are
Now,
some interesting, yeah, there are
now,
interesting connections with
yeah.
that we might go
Yeah,
into.
yeah. It's certainly interesting. I don't know how conclusive it is, but it's certainly interesting. Let's move on to this sightings. There are these people who say that they encountered Bernard and Peggy seemingly after this all happened. Let's talk about that now.
Well, there was a couple of them. One where he thought he was in somebody, a milk hauler, thought they saw him in a bathroom at a truck stop in Painesville, which isn't that far away. Um, then we have the one in Moorhead with the in the Vega. And then another couple stated that during a Memorial Day weekend, they were at a lake. Bernard and Peggy stopped there. The women fished. The guys had drank some beer, talked. The guy stated that Bernard told him that he was doing carpentry work. And the guys got a little jagged up, and the women ended up talking. They ended up taking off and leaving. But the guy at the lake identified them as Bernard and Peggy. Now, the question that in the paperwork that's there, it can't be answered whether or not this gentleman from Osage, Minnesota, which is a little ways away, but not still relatively close, knew Bernard and Peggy prior to this meeting, or if after the fact that he said, hey, those are the people I talked to at the lake. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing I can't get. I've got a telephone number for the guy, but he doesn't seem to answer his phone ever. I have talked to people that know him. One of the firefighters I talked to knew him, and he speculated he's kind of an old farmer, recluse, and he would have a hard time for thinking that this guy would have known somebody from Wolf Lake with any kind of intimacy at all, because he was one of those people that just basically stayed in town, on the farm, in the county type thing, that he wouldn't have been out that far. So that's another curious thing. It'd be nice to know conclusively if he knew them.
Yeah. But this was allegedly, though, after this all happened.
Yep.
And and just explain, where was this again?
It was around Osage, Minnesota, which would probably be 35 miles away from the Wolf Lake area, I believe, if my memory.
Okay.
One of the firefighters that I talked with too lives in Osage now.
Okay. Now, there was also allegedly another sighting, I think, just of Peggy on TV.
Yeah, there was someone in Detroit Lakes was watching an episode of the Today Show and believed that they saw Peggy as an injured person in the earthquake footage. It was Coligno or something like that. I'm trying to remember I didn't put it down in my notes here. Mm-hmm. There's footage of the earthquake results, like on YouTube you can find, but I haven't found like NBC Today Show footage.
Okay.
The deputies from Becker County did reach out to detectives in that county. There's notes about them making the phone calls and stuff like that. There was nothing conclusively noted about a yay or a nay, or if they located somebody who this person was in the video. So there's nothing really conclusive on what they got back. I would assume if they thought it was, they would have pursued it more. I did try to contact NBC Archives to see if there would be footage from the Today Show around the time the Today Show of that earthquake. And apparently right before I made that request, they quit fulfilling requests from the public and just did it for news agencies. So I wasn't able to find any any of that footage to see if I could pick anything out in itself.
Okay, and we know how remote a possibility, what are the odds of something like that actually being true, but and we also know a lot of people look like each other across the world, a lot of people on this planet, so we have to keep that all in mind. But obviously it was noteworthy enough that somebody brought it up. Okay, let's move on to this now. What have you been able to deduce from both Peggy and Bernard's families as to their reaction to all of this? For example, his ex-wives, her ex-husband, Bernard's children, maybe the one that he knew the best, maybe the one that he worked, the son that he worked with. What were their reactions to this? Did they do anything to try to figure out what happened to these two? What can you say about all that?
With the middle mother of some of the children, there was no real interview with her. I know they talked to her, and they gave a polygraph to her, Bernard's wife, in Fargo and a couple other people, and they all passed basically. I know when the detectives went to talk to Bernard's wife, Margaret, in Fargo, she basically said, he'd stop by here and there for birthdays a little bit and drop off a card and visit here and there. But she wasn't, she thought that Bernard had maybe divorced her and she didn't know about it. So she was unsure if they were actually still married or not. But I came across in other interviews, like in the newspaper later on, that she uh, didn't really want to at least vent any ill feelings or anything towards it. The only thing that it shows that she was, there was a property that they had owned on a lake. There was no real insurance money that I could tell that was coming from Bernard. There was a property that was owned, a lakeshore property they owned that they were planning on building on. There was only a few payments left. She was looking at maybe getting that property back, and because I believe there were some missed payments after that that was putting it close to foreclosure. So she retained an attorney to retain that property. The only one that I could tell that Bernard was really close to was his eldest son, Ben, his namesake. They had worked together at the car dealership in Fargo. Ben was seemed a little indifferent. There's a lot of correspondence and interviews with him with the investigators, although he had a lot of theories about maybe this happened, maybe that happened. Nothing that really had any kind of solid ground to it. He had mentioned once that his dad wanted to grow marijuana on the farm eventually. He thought that maybe somebody had to killed them and brought them over to the chicken farm across the road and put them into the grinders. He thought maybe there was organized crime involved because of the car dealership stuff. There's a lot of speculation out there. That was from the closest family member out there. Peggy's, there's really no comment on. The only thing I feel, I'll bring it up here too, is that Brian, the 8-year-old that died, his remains were held until like 1981, I believe, in the county by the county coroner. And this brings into a thing here. Brian had no family there to claim his body. When you look at it, you have Bernard, who had several kids with a couple different women, his wife, who's alienated himself from that area. Peggy divorced her husband, 2 kids there, no real family. So when you leave Brian with no extended family involved with this, there was really nobody left to claim him. His parents were both gone, and there was nobody else. His parents really for him, so it was kind of a lost boy. So that's really kind of somber and sobering, and it basically was married by the county in the 80s. So as far as family goes, that's one of the things that I always think about. But yeah, there was nothing real. Nobody seemed real surprised, but again, it's just the mystery of any kind of a motive for it. Lots of speculation. Excuse me, but yeah, it's kind of. But yeah, there's nothing really brought up directly, and most of the things the son brought up were just kind of random speculation. So.
Okay. Have Peggy and Bernard ever been declared deceased?
Bernard was declared deceased. I don't believe, from what I found, Peggy ever was.
Okay.
I had heard recently something that if you have somebody declared dead, all investigations have to stop, which I think that's crap. I don't believe that at all. But that would be the only reason I could see why Peggy was never declared deceased. And then again, I think with Bernard, it had a lot to do with Social Security money. Estate. I don't think Peggy had much of an estate per se, where Bernard had property, different things like that, maybe pension, maybe Social Security money. So it was probably more imperative that they have him declared deceased to settle up all those things.
Right. Okay. Let's move on to a little bit. Of course, we have done maybe a little more theorizing than I usually do in interviews, simply because, of course, Joe is not a family member, and he should get an opportunity to offer his own insights. He's the one with the facts and can look at them in an objective manner. So, as the listeners and viewers know, we've done a little more speculating than we usually do. But being that you got into this some years ago, wanting to look at crime and disappearances in Minnesota, are there any other crimes or disappearances like this in Minnesota, to your knowledge, Joe?
Nothing that I've found that, at least in recent history, that fits this kind of scenario. I mean, you get, you're missing 411 stuff, missing hunters, missing things like that.
Mm-hmm.
This has been really unique as far as what actually went down. So, I mean, we've debated on the phone. I mean, well, maybe this, maybe that. But
Yeah,
when you go down to exactly what happened, you can't find, it's difficult to find any reason why uh, the boy would have died, the house would have burned, and they would have been separated. If somebody
mm-hmm.
had something, Bernard, leave them all die in a house fire. Nobody thinks
That's
that was
right.
wrong.
That's
There's
right. If you want them all dead, just leave them in the fire. Yeah,
trying to find a scenario. I mean, we've ran things back and forth, but you go back, well, but then why do this? And that's one of the most complex things and one of the most aggravating things, frustrating things about the whole thing is trying to find any kind of reason um, uh, outside of the family uh, that would justify this kind of scenario. And that's, I think too, when your listeners do start to speculate, they will, that would be something too to look back, but why did it happen this way? Why did the
right.
boy get left behind? Why are those two gone? And that's the thing that throws a wrench in a lot of
Of
the
course it
speculation.
does. Of course it does. I agree with you. So, as I've already stated, and the listeners maybe can do this off the top of their heads, that we've had some disappearances where burnings have occurred. Dorianne Myers, Laura Bible, and Ashley Freeman, Jeremy Burt, just to name a few. Maybe there might be one or two more in there. But so this is not a new topic, but certainly. Maybe this is most like Laura Bible and Ashley Freeman's, where there was a burning and two people were found and they had been shot. No proof that that happened to Brian, but remains were found in that. And we do know that Laura Bible and Ashley Freeman were taken and for the purposes of being raped and then murdered and disposed somewhere, but they've still not been found over 20 years later. So maybe there's some similarities to that. You could see similarities to Dorianne Myers, given that parts of her house were burned, and it is not believed that she did that. Who knows who did it? I have my own beliefs, but then her car was burned, found burned 80 miles away. But regarding the locals of that area, do these disappearances have any kind of local lore? You've talked about how locals maybe have pointed the finger at this deputy, but is this still even a topic of conversation the local little places that the locals hang out? Does this even come up, do you think, these days?
There's the Becker County Sheriff's Office did a Facebook posting not too long ago, just as a look back type thing and saying that it's still open. Through that is where I found a lot of these firefighters. There's only one firefighter that was interviewed in the cold case investigation. I don't think anything prior to that. So I found a couple of these firefighters through that post going through there. Two things that goes, there's some strong feelings. Uh, I was introduced to one of the firefighters through his daughter, and she stated that because of the um, circumstances with that fire, it's something that they'll still talk about here and there. Um, for the fact that the boy died and that there was, rumors around town. I don't think there's a lot of current speculation. Like if you weren't around then, I don't think that it really comes into conversation. Like I said, the firefighters were on scene, and like the things that stick with you, like the smell of a burning body, those are things you don't forget.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it exists yet in that fashion. But the family still looks and goes online, and you see on some of the websites and stuff, there's some comments from various people that were related to Bernard in some way or another. But as far as anything else goes, I don't think it's really been um, remembered in the area or
Okay.
talked about.
Anything that you've ever heard that shows that maybe Bernard and Peggy made plans to leave, wrapping up any sort of loose strings regarding finances, getting plane tickets, anything on their bank records, anything like that that they were planning ever, not just that evening, that day, but any time in the future,
The
anything.
bills, the bills seem to be paid. They did have some money in the bank, not a lot, but enough that they wouldn't be in, you know, a little better than living paycheck to paycheck, I guess. I don't think they had a lot of extra money, but they had enough money to do with what they, they needed to do. Um, Nothing ever showed that there was any preparation amongst, um, from coworkers or anybody that knew them, um, that anything in their behavior had changed at all.
Hmm.
And, including that that they were planning on something. If they did, which isn't out of the question, because I told you it's either they ran or somebody took them.
Yeah.
It's one way or the other. And maybe there was, it's all conjecture, but you could look at if a car thing came out where, a car taken there. If it was something that they had planned out, it had to have been in the making for a long time. So it wasn't just the crap we got to leave type thing. It had to be put in the works for quite some time before that. Maybe not years, but definitely a month or two.
Mhm.
Um, and then as far as finding anybody else with a motive to abduct the parents would be, it's you could run 1,000 different directions with that one.
Right. Right. Even as I have in my notes here, getting toward the end of this interview, if someone caused this disappearance, what would be the reason for taking Peggy and Bernard but leaving the son? It is hard to understand. If you really want to kill all of them, then the easiest way to do is just leave them in the house. And because even to this day, Brian's part of his remains were found, but we really don't technically know why he died. It very well could have been smoke inhalation. It very well could have been that he was strangled. We'll never know. Why couldn't they have done that to the adults as well? We just don't know. Why would someone cause somebody, as you've heard me talk about many times, that why would somebody go about causing something this complex? If you really wanted to make Bernard and Peggy, disappear, why go through all of this? Would there not have been more, an easier way to do all of this? What do you think about all of that, Joe? Of course, once again, you've been working on other disappearances. We were on here for talking about Milda's. I know you've covered some other disappearances. What is your insight into all this from your experience?
It's still strange because even if you needed to take Bernard and Peggy or something, trying to get a mother away, because they said Peggy was rather a doting mother to
Mm-hmm.
Brian. So even if Brian would have died uh, by some mistake or some misadventure type thing,
Mm-hmm.
to have her leave uh, your child like that. Um, so if you're abducting Bernard and Peggy, you have to deal with a mother who has got to be grieving and upset. And how do you, I mean, just dealing with something like that as far as abducting someone, um, it would be, I mean, that's that much more of an issue that I'm trying to deal with two adults. And even leaving on their own, it's like the reason to leave Brian behind. What was the reason for that? Would it be,
Right.
you know, burn
Right.
the house down? It looked like the whole family was abducted. There's so much that just doesn't make sense. I mean, we've came up with so many scenarios, then you step back and go, yeah, but why?
Yeah, but
And
yes, yeah, but dot dot dot.
I
Yes,
mean,
it's true.
we've talked a little bit. I have a couple different avenues that I've pursued as far as potential motivations and motives for it, but none of it brings it back to why this here now.
Yeah, and what I say to that, I could certainly be open to the idea that could this have something to do with insurance? Could this have something to do that Bernard knew about something going on at his job or anything else? But then it would seem like, well, really, what could he have known? I mean, if that was really the case, there would be people dying like this all the time in Minnesota, but there isn't. So if Bernard knew something or Peggy knew something, why aren't more people like them disappearing or dying? Or but that so that's always the question mark.
One of the interesting things in the case file, and it took me a while to figure it out, there is a multi-page type police flyer in there with your listeners might be familiar with Henry Lucas and Otis Toole,
Mm-hmm.
the serial killers. There was a documentary who filled in a lot of things for me about the confession killer or something like that on Netflix. But they're in this file. They're included in there. This file about them, and for the life of me, I'm going, why is this in here? And after like watching the Netflix thing, I realized that Henry Lee Lucas was confessing to hundreds of murders around the
Yeah.
country at that time. And Otis Toole was in prison at that time for barricading an old man in a house and starting the house on fire.
Huh.
So I can see once we look in hindsight, when you know what their modus operandi was and how they did, I can see where it might have crossed their minds. But although Henry Lucas confessed to hundreds of killings, he still said he never killed anybody in Minnesota. He killed a woman in South Dakota, but nothing there. So he wouldn't even confess to that one. But that was kind of one of those interesting things. Took me a while to figure out why
Yeah.
that was in this file, but just an interesting little anecdote there.
Yeah. Joe, is there a Facebook page or anything set up for Bernard and Peggy's disappearances?
No, I don't believe the family ever has done anything with it. I've
Okay.
just a lot of Reddit posts and things like that you'll find online uh, here and there. I guess my biggest thing with it is to trying to, even with Milda's, is if nothing else, not necessarily trying to solve anything, but make sure that the true and accurate story is put out there.
Yeah.
When you look on those blog posts and stuff, there's so much stuff that's not even remotely accurate. Um, I have the entire case file. I've read the entire case file. I've gone through dozens and dozens and dozens of interviews with people.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating when you start reading stuff online and you can't go back and correct everybody, you know. But that gets frustrating and things. And it's like we had talked before, especially with older disappearances, when you start dealing with even residences and the families, that there's a story that's been presented over 40 years. This is how it went. These are the things that happened.
Yeah.
And it becomes basically folklore. And it's not all necessarily true and accurate, but that's just how the story has grown over
That's
decades.
right.
And that's a story that keeps getting repeated. So that's one of the things too. I've been, not that I'd ever be able to necessarily solve anything, but the biggest thing is going into it and trying to bring out the most accurate picture of events. And if they can, find out any little extra insights would be nice too. So yeah, everybody would love to solve a
Sure.
mystery, solve something.
Sure.
Maybe something will happen, but I'm just right now. I'm more concerned with bringing out the accurate story.
Right.
So,
Joe, any final words before we complete this interview?
no, again, Ed, I'd like to thank you for inviting me back on. Hopefully,
Mm-hmm.
your listeners find it uh, listenable and entertaining, and
Yeah.
enough. And again, too, I appreciate what you do for all these families.
Thank you.
It's something that needed to be done, and you don't find it anywhere else. And that you're giving these families a chance to express themselves, tell their stories about them and their family members. You aren't finding that anywhere else. Um, are we going to solve anything? Maybe, maybe not. But
Maybe.
these insights and letting you and letting your listeners and viewers know exactly where these families are coming from, that they aren't forgotten. Like we talked about before, my thing is once these stories leave the news cycle, they get buried in the back
Yeah,
someplace. And unless you're living with this tragedy every day, everyone else goes on with their life.
it's true.
So it's great to have these things remembered with Milda, with Bernard and Peggy, to bring it back to the forethought so that we can remember them, remember their families a little bit. So I appreciate what you do with that.
All right, thanks. And I appreciate you being on this episode of Unfound.
Thank you, Ed.
You're welcome. And that was my September 12th, 2022 interview with Joe Kisner, amateur sleuth and expert on Bernard and Peggy's disappearances. I thank him for appearing on Unfound for the second time. If you're looking to become an authority on a disappearance, the way Joe goes about his business is a good template to use. I've done a map analysis of this disappearance. I show where the property is and the buildings that still exist on it all these years later. I also show the surrounding area for anyone wondering if Bernard and Peggy could have walked off or been buried nearby. You can find the video on the Unfound podcast channel on YouTube. As I stated in my number 3 question in the summary section, I think I need to go over what the science exactly is of a human body burning. How long does it take, and how hot does the fire need to be for everything, bones, skin, etc., to turn to ash? I've done this before, but it's been a while. So a refresher course is probably needed. This will surely help you as you mull over what happened to Bernard and Peggy. Here are the facts. I went to a variety of sources, cremation websites, funeral home websites, and yes, Wikipedia. The generalities are these. At a temperature of 1400 to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, for an average-sized adult, the cremation process takes 3 to 4 hours. However, something should be noted. The furnace for cremation is preheated. Yes, just like you do cooking in your kitchen oven. Thus, if a funeral home were to just put a body in there at room temperature and turn the machine on, it would take a lot longer to turn the bones and everything to ash. Why? Because the furnace would have to reach 1400 degrees first, which probably takes some time. Only then would the cremation process start, adding at least some minutes to the process. We must also understand that these are under perfect conditions being done by experts, meaning the process is as efficient as it can be. So that time frame of 3 to 4 hours is about as quickly as it can be done. So what are the facts regarding the average house fire? How hot does one get? At firefighterinsider.com, here's what it says. A standard house fire can reach temperatures of up to 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, 815 Celsius. The key words in that sentence are up to, meaning that is the upper range for the average house fire. Even so, 1500 degrees is hot enough to cause a body to start to disintegrate, and we have evidence of that, and that only partial remains of Brian were found in the fire, with the belief that the rest of him turned to ash. But there's also the issue of time. Yes, the house fire for these disappearances might have gotten to 1500 degrees, but it would have had to have stayed there for at least 3 hours at least. And since these were not perfect conditions, with the house not being sealed off like a crematorium, we would have to believe that the fire would have to burn much longer to start turning bone and skin to ash. However, given that only a portion of Brian's remains were found, we must consider that yes, the fire burned longer than 3 hours, maybe much longer. despite the house not being that large. Yet, how could adults Bernard and Peggy be burned to completion when an 8-year-old was not? But were both Bernard and Peggy totally burned? What about the skull found in the collapsed house? Yeah, maybe you forgot about that. So those are the facts. Do with them what you will. Maybe you can clear away some of the smoke that still clouds these disappearances. I'll also leave the theorizing up to you.
And that's the program. Right now, while you are in your podcast platform, Spotify, YouTube, iTunes, wherever, give Unfound a 5-star review, a thumbs up, whatever that platform allows. I thank you for listening. I'm Ed Densel, and you've just finished this episode of Unfound.